Chapter 17 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. LINDBERG. When Hammersley entered the house with von Winden, he was immediately aware that a crisis had come in his affairs. For in the hall leading to the living room stood Captain Wentz and two soldiers, and when he was shown into von Stromberg's presence, the counselor stood with his back to the hearth, his long legs wide apart, his hands behind his back, and the expression of his long bony face was not pleasant to see. He smiled and frowned at the same time, a smile which possessed so few of the ingredients of humor that the tangled brows even seemed less ominous. Doris was nowhere to be seen. Hammersley made no sign of his prescience of trouble. He put his pipe in the pocket of his leather jacket, strolled forward into the room, and stood at attention. "Search him," snapped von Stromberg. And when von Winden had finished, "Leave us," he said to the officer, "and keep within call. I shall need you presently." He waited until the door was closed and then turned to Hammersley somberly. "Your jig is danced, Herr Hammersley. Fräulein Mather has confessed." "Confessed what, Excellenz?" questioned Hammersley calmly. "She has told the truth." "Of course. That was to be expected of her." "Bah!" roared the general. "There's no need of more of that. She told me that you were an English spy." Hammersley started forward, the only expression on his face one of complete incredulity. "Fräulein Mather told you that? Impossible." "Do you mean to say that you don't believe me?" Hammersley managed a smile. "It would hardly be good ethics for me to say that. I simply repeat that it is impossible." "Why?" von Stromberg sneered. "Because it is morally impossible for her to tell an untruth." "Ach, so. But it is physically impossible for her to keep from not doing so." He leaned forward, grinning craftily. "In the small games of life, in the things which amount to nothing, women lie with a careless skill that is amazing. But in the game of life and death, their little tricks are negligible. Poof! Herr Hammersley, did you expect to match mere falsehood? And such a tissue of flimsy evidence against a man of my experience? It was a desperate game from the beginning, one which could have had only one end. You have been clever, very, very clever. In time, perhaps, under proper guidance and with the necessary political opinions, you could have succeeded in becoming a very useful helper of the universe through the medium of the Secret Service Department of the German Empire. But such cleverness is superficial and quickly burns out in the hotter fire of genius. I would like you to know." "One moment, Excellenz," put in Hammersley coolly. "Am I to understand from your attitude that you believe I am false to the Vaterland?" Von Stromberg laughed. "You still insist on acting out the part?" Hammersley did not answer the question. Instead, he asked, "Will you be good enough to tell me upon what new evidence you base your present position?" The counselor strode to the table and thrust the telegraphic message he had shown to the girl under Hammersley's nose. "This," he growled. "I will read it to you. Hammersley caused arrest of Byfield. Has informed on Rizzio and myself. It is signed Maxwell. What do you think of my evidence?" He grinned. "Convincing, nicht wahr?" Hammersley looked up into von Stromberg's face with a smile. "Not even in code, Excellenz. It is a pity you did not write it in English. But under the circumstances, you can't expect me to take any interest in such a trick." "Not you, Herr Hammersley," he chuckled. "It is not necessary that you should believe in it. In fact, there are reasons why you shouldn't believe in it. The most important reason being that Herr Maxwell is dead." "Dead?" "Obviously. You condemned him and he was put in prison. If he is not dead, it is through no fault of yours." Hammersley smiled. "You cannot get me to acquiesce in such strange statements." "I do not ask you to acquiesce. I could not expect to catch Herr Hammersley by a trick, but Miss Mather was less difficult." Hammersley's jaws set. "I understand. But do you mean to say that I can be incriminated by a confession made under the stress of a terror artificially produced?" "That is a clever turn of phrase, Herr Hammersley, worthy of the high regard with which I hold your abilities. In reply, I can only say that in time of war, my deductions in all matters connected with my department are final. You are an English spy, Herr Hammersley, and you are quite aware of the penalty." Hammersley raised his head and folded his arms. "Quite," he replied. "If you choose to take that action, I can only say that the time will come when you will regret it." "I must take that chance, for there will be no trial." Hammersley shrugged his shoulders and turned aside. His face was white and the muscles at his jaws worked for a moment, but otherwise he gave no sign of emotion. General von Stromberg had gone back to his favorite pose by the mantel, and Hammersley again heard his voice. "It seems a pity, Herr Hammersley, that after all it should be you instead of Herr Rizzio who is the culprit. You are a type of young man very much to my liking, and the position of the young lady is unpleasant in the extreme. She has served her purpose here, and I shall of course take immediate steps to have her returned to her own people." "Thanks," said Hammersley dryly. "But the thing that has interested me in your case from the first," he continued with a return of his mastodonic playfulness, "and indeed still continues to interest me, is why you should choose to return to Germany when you knew that you were under suspicion. Surely you did not come here to pick cowslips in March? Come now, I could have you shot this afternoon if I chose. Tell me the truth and I will promise to postpone the affair until tomorrow." Hammersley studied the pattern in the rug thoughtfully for a moment, and at last he straightened and shrugged again. "I don't suppose there's any use playing the game further. Since I am to go, it doesn't matter if I tell you. I have planned for some time to be able to get plans of the recent additions to the fortifications of Strasbourg." "Ach, so, Strasbourg. And what, may I ask, were to be your means of procuring them?" "That, of course, since my utility has ceased, cannot possibly be of interest to you." Von Stromberg studied him narrowly for a long moment and then wagged his head sagely. It was an unnecessary suspicion that he had cherished. This had been a case with interesting aspects, but after all, it was not much out of the usual way. An English spy betrayed by the simplest of tricks upon the credulity and affection of a woman. He thought that Hammersley had been after bigger game. Plans, fortifications, the same objects, the same methods. Von Stromberg had tried to puzzle out in the mazes of his wonderful brain the possible chance that this man could have had of learning of the whereabouts of Herr Gottschalk's memoranda and of the momentous decision which had been reached in the Wilhelmstrasse with regard to them. He studied Hammersley closely, with something approaching regret that the contest between them could not have been waged at greater length and for higher stakes. He felt a genuine human sorrow at this moment over the impending fate of this handsome young man who was only doing his duty for the fatuous English. It was too bad. But there was much else to do. Tomorrow his mission in this part of the empire would be ended, and the Wilhelmstrasse was calling. He touched the bell upon the table and Captain Wentz entered. Herr Hammersley is to be taken to the room on the third floor. Tonight you will see that he is securely bound and a guard set over him within the room. You will place another guard outside below his window. If he tries to escape, shoot him. Wentz spoke to the man in the hall, and Hammersley, between them, was led to the foot of the steps and followed his captors to the upper story. He knew, in view of the instructions that he had overheard, that any effort to escape would be fruitless. He sat on the edge of the bed, submitting calmly, while his feet and hands were bound under the direction of Captain Wentz, after which the officers went out, leaving a man to guard him and lock the door. Hammersley rolled over on the bed and lay for a long while, staring at the wall. The day was fading into dusk. 5 o'clock it might be, Hammersley guessed. 6 hours or less remained to him in which to act. 6 hours in which he must lie helpless, while the one chance of intercepting the messenger from Berlin came and passed. He lay perfectly still as he had fallen, but his spirit writhed in agony. Doris was in a room near him, likewise a prisoner, aware of the fate in store for him and able to do nothing but wait as he would wait until the shots were fired below there in the garden, which would be the end of all things for him. He found that he was thinking little of himself. It was Doris and what she must be suffering that occupied the moments of his thoughts, which were not given to the remote chances of escape. His bonds were tightly drawn, a rope tied with German thoroughness. He moved his hands behind him and tried to gain a little room for his present ease. If he was to be shot tomorrow morning, it would have seemed indeed a small charity to have permitted him to pass his last night in some degree of comfort. Could it be that after all, von Stromberg suspected the real object of his return? That hardly seemed possible, for his informant in Berlin, a woman close to those in high authority, had made every move with the utmost discretion, and his own relations to LINDBERG could not possibly be suspected. LINDBERG. Hammersley turned and looked at his guard, who was standing motionless by the window, gazing out at the fading landscape. LINDBERG was his last desperate hope. Udo von Winden, his cousin, it was too much to hope that Udo would be of service to him. He had caught a glimpse of Udo's face in the hallway downstairs when von Stromberg's orders were given. He had gone pale and stared at him in pity and horror as Hammersley had gone up the stairs, but Hammersley knew that the ties of kinship, the memories of their boyhood together, were nothing beside the iron will and indomitable authority of the great man who had condemned him. Udo would suffer when Hammersley died, for there had been a time when the two had been much to each other, but he would do his duty, however painful, as a small unit of the relentless machine which Hammersley had had the temerity to oppose. What else could be expected? A word, a sign, the slightest aid to such a prisoner, and he would be as guilty as his cousin. Hammersley knew that he did Udo no injustice in supposing that any help from such a source was out of the question. If Udo had been caught in England, as Hammersley was caught in Germany, Hammersley knew that he could do nothing to save him. But Lindberg, here the case was different. It was Lindberg whose life Hammersley had saved 3 years ago in this very forest, when the forester had stumbled and fallen in the path of an angry boar who would have gored him to death if Hammersley had not shot the beast. Lindberg, the forester, it was, who in his hours off duty had been Hammersley's chosen companion in many a hunt up through the rocky gorges of these very mountains, every stick and stone of which he knew as he knew his own rugged face in a mirror. It was Lindberg who had been so useful in keeping him informed of the exact state of affairs at Blaufelden. It was Lindberg who had learned of the microphone that von Stromberg had installed. And it was Lindberg who had listened at the receiver upstairs in von Stromberg's room to the conversation when the counselor had told Captain Wentz the nature of the documents from Berlin and the hour of their arrival. Already Lindberg had repaid 100-fold the debt of Hammersley's service, and it was quite possible now that Hammersley's actual mission had been discovered that he would take to cover, his mind clear in the thought that he had done all that could be expected of him. But there was a warm affection between the two, born of many a long day in the open and many a night by the campfire where the old man had taught him the forester's secrets of the trees, the birds in their branches, and of the many four-legged things that scurried beneath them. They had often talked, too, of many other things, and Hammersley had learned that Lindberg's politics were those that one learns under the open sky, the eternal peace of nature before which war and men, its armed instruments, were a blasphemy. Perhaps Lindberg would find a way. But what way? How? Udo von Winden, too, was aware of the Woodcraft Fellowship, for often he had made their duet a trio. Hammersley knew that Udo von Winden as yet suspected nothing of the services Lindberg had rendered him, and he wondered whether in this pass the ties of kinship would be strong enough to keep him silent as to the possible capabilities of the old forester for mischief in Hammersley's behalf. Hammersley hoped. He clung to the thought of Lindberg's fidelity and affection as a dying man clings to the hope of heaven. He tried to analyze the old man's capacities for sympathy and courage. To help a man in his position seemed to require larger stores of both of these qualities than human clay was molded for. Lindberg did not fear death, he knew, but the death he courted was the kind of death Hammersley had saved him from, a good death in a fair game with a noble enemy, not the kind of death that awaited Hammersley, a cold, machine-made death against a kitchen wall. And he must know, as Hammersley knew, that this was what would follow. The dusk faded into dark, and the soldier lit a candle. Hammersley turned his head and examined him attentively. His face was unfamiliar at Blaufelden. One of the men probably sent down at von Stromberg's orders from the upper district to be useful in just this emergency. Von Stromberg would make no mistakes, of course. He never did make mistakes. He had enough men about him to cope with the situation safely. He would leave no opportunity for his plans to miscarry. Any opportunity, should there be one, must be created. Hammersley managed to wriggle into a sitting posture on the bed and spoke to his captor in German. "You wouldn't mind my having a smoke, would you?" he asked. The man looked at him, debating the matter. "Just get into the side pocket of my jacket and fish out my pipe and tobacco, mein Junge. I need a smoke badly, and so would you, if you were going to be shot in the morning." "Ach, wohl. I see no harm in that, mein Herr. You cannot smoke yourself away." He came over, brought out Hammersley's short pipe, filled it from the pouch, and stuck it between his lips. Then he got out a match and lighted it while Hammersley puffed. "Ah," said Hammersley contentedly. "You are a good fellow. Tomorrow morning I will give you my blessing." The man paced stolidly up and down beside the bed. "I am sorry for you, mein Herr, but it is life. It is all decided for us beforehand. We are here a moment and then we are gone." Hammersley smiled. "A fatalist? Then perhaps you can tell me if there is any chance of my escape." He was stopped abruptly. "I can tell you that there is not," he said severely. "I would have said as much, but it was a pardonable curiosity, nicht wahr?" "Pardonable, jawohl," the man replied. "But most unseemly under the circumstances." "You have a deep sense of your responsibilities." "Ja, I obey my orders. That is all. I do not care what others do." "Therefore you will shoot me tomorrow." "Perhaps," he shrugged. "I am but an instrument of Providence." He waved his hand. "But I talk too much, and so do you. It is not seemly in a soldier and a prisoner." Hammersley laughed. "You have a fine sense of the fitness of things." "Ja, it was so written." He relapsed into silence and, in spite of efforts on Hammersley's part, refused to speak further. It was only after Hammersley badgered him for his unsociability that he spoke with some asperity. "I will trouble you to be quiet. When I am relieved, my successor may let you speak and laugh as much as you please. But it is unnatural in a man at the point of death. It would be better if you were saying your prayers." "I am sure that you are right, but I still have a few hours. Perhaps you wouldn't mind telling me the hour at which you are to be relieved, the hour when we are both of us to be relieved." The man gazed at him uncomprehendingly. "After supper," he finished indifferently. 8 o'clock, perhaps." Hammersley was silent. 2 hours or more to wait before a change of guards, and then only a chance that Lindberg would be able to do something. Even then, if he managed to get loose, there was little more than an hour in which to reach the road by which the machine would come from Berlin. And even then, what should he do without Doris? His case was desperate. Only a miracle, it seemed, could make a success of what had been a pitiful failure. Only an act of Providence could save him from the discreditable end that awaited him. He drew up his knees and studied the knots at his ankles. His guardian was the one who had tied them. "You tie a good square knot, my friend. You were once a sailor?" But nothing would induce the soldier to talk. As the supper hour approached, Hammersley could hear the rattle of pans and dishes downstairs and noticed the odor of coffee. They would not starve him, of course. In a little while someone would come with food. After a while, which seemed interminable, the noise of the rattling dishes ceased and there was a sound at the door into the hall as the key turned in the lock and Captain Wentz entered. His sturdy back had never seemed so ugly nor so welcome, for the silence and the inaction were getting on Hammersley's nerves. The officer came over to the bed and gravely examined the knots of the rope that bound the prisoner. Then, satisfied with the results of his inspection, he straightened and glanced around the room. "Good," he muttered. And then to the soldier, "You will go down and tell LINDBERG to bring Herr Hammersley's supper. I will stay here in the meanwhile. You will then relieve the man at the door of His Excellence." The man saluted and departed. They still trusted Lindberg. Then Udo had suspected nothing, or if he had suspected, had kept his thoughts to himself. Hammersley lay back on the pillow, preparing a stolid indifference for Lindberg's entrance. And when the meal was brought, Wentz untied his hands and stood over him with an automatic while he ate. "Your weapon makes a poor relish, Herr Hauptmann," said Hammersley with a laugh. "I greatly regret its necessity," replied Wentz with his machine-made politeness. Hammersley ventured nothing further, eating silently and with a surprising appetite, for good Lindberg's face in the background had given him new courage. When the meal was done, he asked for his pipe again, and Wentz ordered the forester to fill it. Hammersley inhaled the smoke and exhaled a sigh. "So far as I am concerned, Herr Hauptmann," he said with a smile, "when this pipe is finished, you may kill me at once." He extended his wrists behind him in silence while Captain Wentz took half a dozen turns of the rope and made it fast. Hammersley sat up in bed, puffing at his pipe and wondering whether some miracle might not be induced that would kill Wentz. But he was quickly disillusioned, for when Lindberg took the dishes and moved toward the door, he heard Wentz's crisp orders. "You will send Max Senf to take the first night watch upon the prisoner. He is awaiting my orders in the guardroom. Schnell!" Without even a glance at the prisoner, Lindberg saluted and went out, and Hammersley's spirits fell. Help from Lindberg was impossible. Von Stromberg was taking every precaution. There was no way out of it. Hammersley was doomed. But while Wentz was in the room, he kept a cheerful countenance, though for the first time in his life that he could remember, his pipe was acrid. He saw the new guard enter and heard the last orders of the officer. "You will watch until 1 o'clock, when your relief will be sent. The prisoner is to be allowed no privileges. Under no circumstances are his hands to be untied. If he wants water, you will give it to him with your own hands. Verstehen Sie?" The man stood erect and saluted. "Zu Befehl, Herr Hauptmann," he said. Hammersley saw the door close and heard the key turn in the lock while Senf came forward into the room and stood by the foot of the bed. Hammersley studied him closely. A tall, loosely jointed man in his early 30s with the heavy brows and high cheekbones of the East Prussian, the face of a Slav almost, with something of the thoughtful intensity of the South German mystic. His eyes were large, his nose thin, and his face was bearded, but the lines of his mouth had a sensitive curve, belied by the big bony hands and broad shoulders. A sentimentalist, perhaps. Hammersley determined to try him, for a plan had been forming in his mind. He had noticed with a glance, which had included everything in the room when he entered, a Bible upon the mantel shelf, and in a tone which had in it a solemn sense of the doom which awaited him in the morning, he addressed his guardian quietly. "Senf, you have a kind face. There is a small favor that you may do me." "If it does not conflict with my orders." "Not at all. Tomorrow morning I am to be shot. All I ask is that you will allow me to read, for a while, the Bible upon the chimney-piece." "Ah, I see no harm in that." He went over and got the book, opening the pages and looking through them. "It is little enough for a dying man to ask," he said. "Danke," said Hammersley quietly, his face solemn but his mind working rapidly. "It is but right to make one's peace with the world at a time like this." "I am sorry, mein Herr," said the man mournfully. "It is not good for a man to die in the first flush of youth." If it could only have been in the open, Senf, a soldier's death. But this, ach wohl, we can only go once. It doesn't matter." He gave a deep sigh and asked his guardian to light his pipe again and open the book of the Psalms of David. "I cannot turn the pages, my friend. It is a pity. But propped upon one elbow I can see quite well. If you will but put the candle here upon the bed." The man did as requested and Hammersley thanked him. "You are a kind fellow. It is bread upon the waters. You will find it after many days." "It is nothing. I would expect as much from another." "Now, if you will permit, I would prefer the solitude of my thoughts." The soldier turned slowly away and Hammersley bent his gaze upon the open page, but he did not read. He was thinking, planning, watching the movements of Max Senf. 8 o'clock was long past. It must be nearly 9. But 2 hours remained before the arrival of the messenger from Berlin. His guardian paced slowly up and down the room between the door and the window, and Hammersley felt, if he did not see, his deep bovine gaze fixed upon him from time to time. 8 or 10 times the man took the length of the room and then, with a deep sigh, he sank into the chair at the foot of the bed. Hammersley did not move his head, which remained bent forward over the book, but from the tail of his eye he noted that the tall footboard of the old-fashioned bed partially concealed him. Propped up as he was, he could see the man's head as far down as the tip of his nose, but all of his head was in shadow. Arguing from this, everything upon the bed below the line of the flame of the candle was invisible to him, but a quick glance showed Hammersley that the man was not looking at him. His dark eyes were peering straight before him at the opposite wall, and his mind was wrapped in some gloomy vision. The plan he had in mind required subtlety. He marked the shadows upon the ceiling and moved up in the bed so that his own shadow would be thrown behind the line of sight of his guardian. Then he paused again, his eyes fixed on the pages, waiting for Senf to look at him again. He heard the man move in his chair, which creaked as he settled more comfortably into it. And when Hammersley looked again, only his eyes were visible, their gaze fixed darkly ahead of him. Hammersley now puffed a volume of smoke from his pipe and slowly wriggled his left arm forward under him so that he could see the knot that tied his wrists. It was a large knot, but vulnerable. He puffed more smoke, meanwhile watching the top of the head of Senf. As it did not move, he lay over half upon his back and, taking care not to disturb the book, slowly advanced his arms behind him toward the blaze of the candle. The knot of the rope caught and blazed, but the candle sputtered, and he quickly withdrew his hands, sending a volume of smoke from his pipe to neutralize the odor. Senf sniffed the air curiously. "Something is burning," Hammersley heard him mutter. "My pipe," he explained carefully. "It is a vile tobacco, but it will go out of the crack at the window." "Will you not try mine, Herr Hammersley? Perhaps it is better." "No, thanks. Nothing much matters to a dead man." His guardian settled back in his chair, and Hammersley repeated his maneuver more daringly, his own pipe seething like a furnace. "You are a furious smoker, Herr Hammersley," said Senf again. "It is the way one smokes, mein Junger, when one smokes for the last time," he replied. But the fellow got up, sniffing and walking around the room. "It is a most curious tobacco," he muttered. Hammersley's wrists pained him where his bonds had cut, but he kept his gaze upon the page of the book, and Senf sat in his chair again. A strong pull of his arms and Hammersley felt the tension relax. His bonds came looser, and after a few more efforts, his wrists were free. His heart was jumping, and he feared a stray glance of the watcher might see the throbbing of the blood at his temples. But he clasped his hands behind him and waited, slipping the sundered rope beneath a fold of the blanket. 2, 3 minutes passed, and Sylph did not move. The untying of his feet might prove a difficult matter, but he made the venture, working slowly and patiently, his gaze on Sylph's head. Then, as the knot yielded a little to his prying fingers, his gaze quickly concentrated on it. In his efforts, he must have made a sound or a suspicious movement of the shoulders, for when he looked up, he saw the head of Max Sylph projecting above the tailboard of the bed, his large eyes protruding with amazement. They gazed at each other for a tense fraction of a second and then sprang upright. Hammersley threw his feet out upon the floor and leaped for the man, catching him around the waist so that he could not draw a weapon. His legs were useless, and the only chance he had, a desperate one at best, was to drag the man to the floor by sheer weight and there perhaps throttle him. Sylph beat with his heavy fists on Hammersley's head and shoulders, and finally forced him backwards upon the floor, falling with him, but Hammersley still clung with frantic grip which the man could not shake off. But at last he managed to get his fingers around Hammersley's throat and tried to force his head back. Hammersley gasped for breath, but still struggled gamely, though he realized that he had played his last card. Things got dark, and dimly he saw the door of the room open and someone enter. Wentz, of course. His game was up. Sylph was panting heavily. "He burnt the rope," Hammersley heard him say. "Come, help me. He has a grip of iron." The figure from the door moved quickly around the squirming figures, and Hammersley saw the reflection of the candle on something bright, a knife. He heard a blow, and the mass of struggling flesh above him suddenly collapsed and smothered him with its weight. With an effort he struggled free and rolled aside, looking up into the grim face of LINDBERG. "Shh," the man whispered. "I had to do it. There was no other way. I've been waiting outside." Hammersley tried to speak, but his throat closed, and while he struggled for his breath, he saw LINDBERG go to the door and stand, his ear to the keyhole, listening. In a moment he came back. "Ganz gut. They have heard nothing." "Are you sure?" Hammersley managed to gasp as LINDBERG cut the rope that bound his ankles. "Yes, he was so sure of himself that he did not shout." He helped the prisoner to his feet and they clasped hands. "Good, LINDBERG, my friend. I had given up." "I have waited until the beer was served. It is well. And now," he looked around the room quickly, "you shall go." Hammersley had a sudden thought. "Captain von Winden sent you?" "No, he knows nothing, but he has not spoken. It is now after 9 o'clock. By 9:30 you must go." "Ja, doch, but you?" "I shall remain." No, I will not consent to that." "Yes, I have thought out a plan." "But they will suspect. They will shoot you." "No, they will not. Have I not told you that I have thought out a plan?" "I will listen to it." LINDBERG, meanwhile, had been unstrapping his pistol holster and put it on a chair. Hammersley glanced over his shoulder at the door. "But they may come again," he whispered. "I think not. There is little time to lose. We will have to take the chance. But if they return and find me free, it will only cause your death and do me no good." "Herr Hammersley, you should know by this time that I do not waste words. Have I not told you that I made a plan? Listen. This is my story for Herr Hauptmann Wentz. I happened to be in the hallway without, carrying a pitcher of water to the room of Miss Mather. The pitcher is outside on the table. when I hear the sounds of a commotion in this room. Fearing that the prisoner has by some miracle gotten free, I unlock the door with my pass key and enter. You have burned your bonds and killed Zenth. You spring on me and make me a prisoner." He paused. "And you," Hammersley broke in. "You will be left here? No, I won't leave you. Not to that fate. I will not go unless you go with me. We will contrive a way to get out of the country." "Ach nein, will you not listen? Have I not told you that I have thought of everything? I have communicated with the lady. She is ready to go with you. Her room has a dormer window around the corner of the building, and there is a ledge along the roof. You will go to her. The distance to the roof of the kitchen is 30 feet. It will require 4 sheets, yours and hers. They are new ones, and if well twisted, will hold. If you get away safely, you can reach the cave in the THORWALD. No one will ever find you there." "Yes, LINDBERG, but you, what will you say to them? It is no time to waste words. Even now the lady is waiting for you. Come, you must get ready at once." He walked to the bed and quickly stripped off the blankets, twisting the sheets and tying them together. Then he took his pistol belt and fastened it around Hammersley's waist, slipping a handful of loose cartridges into the side pocket of his leather jacket. Hammersley, bewildered by the devotion of his old friend and tossed between alternatives of duty, stood helplessly. At the moment when he needed resolution most, he was supine, but the minutes were passing. The thought of his mission suddenly brought him to life, and his face grew hard, his eyes brilliant with purpose. "Come, LINDBERG, you must go with me." "No," the man insisted. "My plan is the best." "No, you must come with me." "I have made other plans, Herr Hammersley," he whispered gently. "You will go alone. I will give you a reason." And before Hammersley could know what he meant to do, he drew his hunting knife from its sheath in Hammersley's belt and plunged it into his own shoulder. Hammersley could scarcely restrain a cry, but LINDBERG smiled at him and, plucking the weapon out, put it in Hammersley's outstretched hand. "It is nothing," he said. "It will bleed a little. The more it bleeds, the better my case with Excellenz. They will be here in 3 hours, if not before. Now, bind and gag me, quick. There is no time to lose." He lay flat upon the floor, and as in a dream, Hammersley obeyed him, tying his arms and legs. When he had finished, Hammersley bent over the man and touched his hand gently. "Goodbye, old friend. Whatever happens, I will not forget. God bless you." There was a bright, keen look in the small gray eyes upturned to his. That was all Hammersley could see of the swathed head, but it gave him a new idea of self-sacrifice. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Success. Hammersley's first act was to take off his shoes and slip one into each pocket of his jacket. They were soled with rubber, but even that he feared would make a sound. Then he put the box of matches in his pocket and blew out the candle, overturning it on the floor. The shutters of the window were closed, and if they were opened carefully, the man in the garden below might not notice any change in the appearance of the window. Hammersley buttoned his jacket and, carefully pushing back the shutter, peered out. Fortunately, the night had fallen darkly, and overhead black clouds were lowering, and while he hesitated, searching the paths below for the figure of the guard, there was a patter of rain upon the roof. The gods were propitious. At last he made out a dark bulk moving to and fro along the garden path toward the tool house. Hammersley watched, waiting until the man's back was turned, when he opened the shutter wider and threw the rope of sheets out upon the ledge. Closing the shutter again, he came toward the house. So far so good, for the whiteness of the sheets would have been plainly visible had the guard been looking. The next stage of his escape was more difficult, and he let the fellow go and come twice along his path as he timed his new move. He tried the shutter carefully to see that it did not creak and measured with his eye the distance to the living room chimney, which he must reach during the 20 paces the soldier would take toward the tool house. A wind was blowing in the treetops, and somewhere below him a young oak was rustling its last year's leaves. The shutter fortunately opened in the direction in which he must go, so he sat upon the windowsill, doubled up, and when the time came, without looking again at the guard, moved quickly, slipping out noiselessly, closing the shutter behind him, and, gathering up the sheet as he went, crept like a cat on a wall along the narrow ledge. It creaked with his weight, and some small object that his foot had touched grated along the roof and fell to the ground below. A tiny sound at best, but magnified in Hammersley's ears 100 times. He had reached the wide chimney and waited above it, listening for the footsteps of the man below. There was no sound. The man had stopped walking. Hammersley did not dare look out from his hiding place, but he knew that in that moment his fate was hanging in a balance. Just then a heavier gust of wind than usual dislodged a broken branch from a tree nearby, which fell to the ground. Still, the man below did not move, and Hammersley blessed his wisdom in closing the shutter, for he knew that the guard must be peering upward, searching for a sign of anything unusual in its appearance. Hammersley held his breath, straining his ears for the sound that would tell him that he had not failed. In a while, which seemed interminable, it began again. The slow crunch of gravel under a heavy foot ceased and began again, as though uncertainly. So he waited until the sounds were regular as before. Then, advancing his head cautiously, he waited for the proper time, and keeping the chimney between himself and the garden, ran straight up the roof to the gable and crouched quickly upon the other side. He was more fortunate this time, for the roof gave forth no sound. Once beyond the protection of the gables, he could for the moment disregard the danger of the guard, for his orders had been to watch but one window, and Hammersley knew enough of the German character to be sure that the soldier below would not leave that side of the house. As he slid carefully down the roof upon the other side, he saw that there were 2 dormers, and for a moment could not think which of them let into the room in which Doris was imprisoned. He reached the ledge and paused. The shutters of both windows were closed. LINDBERG had told him this, but he swore mildly to himself because he hadn't paid closer attention to the forester's instructions. For while one of the rooms was Doris's, the other he knew was to be occupied by John Rizzio. It was while he hesitated that he heard a whisper at his left, and crawling along the ledge in a moment had reached the window. "Is it you, Cyril?" he heard. "Yes," he whispered. "Let me in." LINDBERG had opened the shutter in the afternoon, but it was still stubborn, and when Cyril put his strength to Doris's, it creaked abominably. It was not really a loud noise, but to the sensitive ears of the fugitives, it seemed as if discovery must be inevitable. At last they managed to open it wide enough to admit Cyril's long legs, and his body speedily followed. Inside the room they stood, their hands clasped, fearful of discovery, listening for sounds without or within which would tell them of the approach of the dreaded events. Nothing but the sighing of the wind in the treetops and the patter of the rain. As hope returned, Hammersley questioned quickly, "You're ready to go?" "Yes," she replied eagerly. "The sheets?" "Here, I have prepared." It was dark and he could not see, but he followed the sheet to its end with his hand and found that it was fastened to the bedpost. How she had managed to move the heavy bed across the room he did not know, and it was unnecessary to question, for there it was. He reassured himself as to the knot that she had made and then fastened his own sheets to the other end. "Do you think you can manage it alone? It will not hold us both." "Try me," she whispered bravely. "The rope will reach almost to the kitchen roof." "Yes, it is just below. I could see the edge of it through the shutter this afternoon." He caught her in his arms and their lips met. "I will go first, and when the tension relaxes, you follow." She pressed his hand as he slid his feet out of the window and paused crouching on the ledge listening. Then he waved his hand and slowly went down. He knew that the angle of the building quite hid him from the garden path, and he slid down the improvised rope as quickly as he could until his feet dangled in space. He looked below him, but in the darkness the distance was uncertain. Had Lindberg miscalculated, or had Doris used too much of the sheet at the upper end? He let himself down until his hands groped the end of the sheet while he felt for a landing with his toes. He touched nothing and still swayed and spun in the air like an apple on a string at All Halloween. A fine mark for an automatic from any of the windows that stared blankly at him from the second story. There was nothing for it but to drop, stretching his toes down to meet the impact. Fortunately, it was not far, but he lost his balance and toppled sideways, catching himself upon an arm and knee. Here again the wind saved him from discovery, but he drew his weapon and kept a look on the corner of the garden, meanwhile watching for Doris. She came at once, slowly but fearlessly, and in a moment he had her safely in his arms, drawing her back near the bulk of the building to crouch and wait and listen again. They did not dare to speak, but Hammersley's blood was surging madly with hope. If they had not been discovered now, the chances were that some time would elapse, enough at least to enable the fugitives to get a start of their pursuers. But the dangling sheet warned Hammersley that they must move quickly. He peered over the edge of the roof. A light was burning in the kitchen, but whether the room was occupied or not, he could not tell. He did not dare risk a sprained ankle by jumping, but found that by lowering himself he could easily reach the fuel box that stood near the kitchen door. In a moment they were on the ground and moving along in the shelter of the hedge toward the hangar. Hammersley exulted. It was something to have brought Doris away, but it was something more to have circumvented von Stromberg. The bundled figure of Lindberg, lying up there bleeding in the dark, shot a pain through his heart, but in action, moving toward the goal of his hopes. Even Lindberg was put behind him. He had no fear for the wound in Lindberg's shoulder. The old man was as tough as a pine knot and would survive the loss of blood. It was Lindberg's ordeal with von Stromberg that bothered him. When they reached the shelter of the woods, the tension relaxed. "We're going to get off, Doris," he said joyously. "I know every stick of these woods, and they can never find us. But I'm afraid the strain has been too much for you. How are you feeling?" "Never better," she said bravely. "Which way now?" Hammersley had paused a moment to slip on his shoes, and as he got to his feet, "Follow me," he said. "If I go too fast for you, let me know." He cut into the woods and presently struck a path which led to the left, and for a while they followed this rapidly. Thanks to a fine physique and a vigorous life out of doors, the girl was in good condition, and though breathing hard upon the slopes, made no murmur. Hammersley knew that he had little time to spare, and Doris followed blindly, asking no questions. She was aware from what Cyril had said in the afternoon that his objective in coming to Germany was now within reach, and she could only judge of its importance to England by the desperate chances he had taken. When it was time that she should know, he would tell her. She judged that Cyril knew that she had been tricked into betraying him, and she made up her mind that whatever happened now, she would stay with him until the end. She owed him that. After a while, when they had been moving for perhaps 20 minutes, they reached an opening in the trees where she could see gray patches of sky through the branches overhead, and her feet emerging from the dry leaves and moss felt a firmer contact. "The Schöndorf Road," he said. "We can follow it side by side. Are you tired?" "No." They went on more rapidly while Hammersley explained. "The documents I came to Germany for are to be brought along this road tonight in an automobile. The hour they are due to reach Blaufelden is 11. And if I know anything of the infallibility of the German secret messenger, they will be here on time. It is now after 10. I have an hour or less to make my preparations." "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Get them. First, I'm going to take you to a spot where you will be as safe as if you were at home in Ashwater Park." "No," she said firmly. "I'm going with you." "But that's impossible. I don't know what may happen. My plans are of the vaguest." "I will share them." "No, you shan't refuse me. I will follow you. I can help. I must. I would die in those roads alone. Don't you understand? But if I fail and they take you, you will be as guilty as I. It is an act of war, Doris." "Then all the more reason why I should be committed to it. They made war on me." "But there will be danger. I can't let you take the risk." "I don't know how you are going to stop me," she said defiantly. He paused, then stopped and caught her by the elbows, peering down into her eyes. Then he laughed. "Mated," he cried. "This is the greatest moment of my life." "And mine," her voice answered him. Her lips met his in a quick caress like those the wives of the Spartans gave when they sent their men to battle. He caught her hand in his and they moved forward more quickly. Along this path, death was riding toward them, but they strode eagerly to meet it, to defy it, to defeat it. Cyril planned rapidly, casting anxious glances along the road behind him. Every foot they traveled took them further from their pursuers, if pursuers there were. Every foot they traveled took them nearer the advancing messenger, so that the farther they went, the longer would be the while before they were overtaken, but the shorter the time for preparation to stop the automobile. Murder was not in Hammersley's line. They passed many places, difficult spots in the road where the machine must also stop and go into low gear to climb declivities, places where projecting rocks jutted rough faces up to the very ruts of the road. It would not be difficult to kill with an automatic at a distance of 2 paces, but Hammersley could not play the game that way. He was a spy, if the laws of war called him so, but he would not, even in this extremity, use the spy's weapons. If the other man fought, it would be different. The desperate nature of the undertaking was beginning to come to him. 2 men, perhaps 3 or even 4. And yet he must win. He must. Slowly but surely a plan was forming, and he made up his mind to put it into practice. "Not tired yet?" he asked. "No, I could go on forever." "Then listen. We are nearing the Thorwald. It is just beyond here, less than half a mile away." "The Thorwald?" "It's a favorite place of mine, known only to LINDBERG and Udo. A cave high up in the rocks, safe as a church, unless Udo happens to hunt for us there." "And will he?" "I hope not. At the foot of the crags this road runs. We must get there first. Can you run?" "I'll try." He gave her his hand again and they settled into a jog trot. She was breathing fast in a moment, but she was game and did not falter, though her lungs seemed to be bursting. But as they neared the spot, Cyril slowed down to a walk again. "At the foot of the glen, there's a dry bed of a stream full of rocks. There used to be a bridge here, but it was washed away. It's an awkward spot, even for a good motor. I'm going to make it worse." He left her, dashing on ahead, while she followed. And when she reached the stream, she saw him dragging one of the bridge timbers across the road. She wanted to help, but he told her to watch until he got another and then another timber into place. And in another moment it was evident that the barricade was formidable enough to deter any machine from crossing. And there was no way to go around, for upon one side rose the crags and upon the other the gully fell away into a dark pit filled with rocks and tangled branches. There was nothing for it now but to wait. And yet it seemed a desperate thing to do. Weary and blown as Doris was, it would have seemed better to have gone on and on, anything to put distance between Cyril and the death that surely awaited them back there. It seemed impossible that so long a time as this could have elapsed before the telltale rope of sheets should have been discovered. Already she was sure that Wentz and his men must be on the way in a machine or on horses, perhaps, which would cover the distance they had traveled in less than a quarter of the time. She thought that she heard the sound of a machine in the distance and the voices of men. She pleaded with him to go on, but he only smiled at her. "You must do what I say, Doris," he said, and then paused, listening. "They're coming," he whispered. She had heard the sound of a machine. "From which direction?" she gasped. "There," and he pointed across the gully. "They'll be here in a moment. Listen to me. Walk quickly to your right, across the road to that large stone. Stop." She obeyed wonderingly. "Now cross the road again, using those rocks as stepping stones." She did it, bewildered, pausing on a ledge of rocks that formed a part of the crag. "Now follow the line of the rocks into the bushes. 50 feet from the road, hidden among the shrubbery, you'll find a cleft in the rocks. Climb it and you'll come out here." And he pointed upward just above the road. "Wait for me there. I'll come in a moment." And as she hesitated, he caught her by the elbows and shoved her along the ledge backwards. "Go! Do you hear? I'll have no refusal." There was no denying the accent of command in his voice or the quick flash of his eye. Never until von Stromberg had badgered her today had a man spoken to her in this tone before. But she loved him for it, rejoiced in his strength, the primitive instinct of woman to obey. When she had gone, Hammersley quickly crossed the stream and took a position behind a thick bush, listening to the exhaust of the approaching machine, but listening and looking too in the opposite direction for sounds of his pursuers. A searchlight made fantastic shapes among the leaves, and long shadows suddenly shot out along the road. Hammersley had drawn his automatic from his pocket and was fingering it coolly. He put his fingers over his eyes so that the light would not mar his familiarity with the darkness. He did not know how many men opposed him and did not seem to care. The main thing now was to keep his eye undimmed and his hand steady. The machine came, slowed down, and stopped, while a guttural exclamation came from the driver. The searchlight focused downward into the rocks of the gully. Screening his eyes from its light with a hand, Hammersley peered out at the occupants of the car. There were 2 men, better than 3, but not so good as one. The man at the wheel rose and got down just beside him, moving forward to remove the obstacles. Hammersley wasted no time. He leveled his automatic at the broad back of the driver, and his voice rang sharply in German. I have come here for the dispatches intended for Herr General von Stromberg. You will give them to me at once. The man who was just bending over toward the timber straightened quickly and turned, reaching for his holster. But the man in the seat of the car, who wore a military cap, was quicker, for there was a report and a bullet sang close to Hammersley's ear. A stream of fire came from Hammersley's automatic. 3 shots in quick succession, and the man in the car pitched forward in his seat and slid to the floor. And by the time the other man had drawn his pistol, Hammersley had leaped behind a tree and came out of some bushes beyond. The chauffeur fired, but not in Hammersley's direction. The continuous glare of the light in their eyes had made their vision in the darkness uncertain. Do you surrender? Shouted Hammersley. The German's reply was to fire at him again and miss. He still stood in the reflection of the headlight, a bulky silhouette which made too fair a mark, while Hammersley stood in the shadows of the bushes. Hammersley pitied him. Surrender, he repeated. The man was not a coward and rushed blindly toward the voice, shooting again, too close for comfort. Well then, Hammersley said and fired again. The man stumbled to his knees and then fell prone, his fingers clutching among the leaves. The whole incident had taken less than a minute, and a deathly silence seemed to fall, following the reverberations of the shots. Hammersley stood tensely, listening and peering along the road toward Blaufelden. There was a glow of light at a distance, and he could now hear the sound of another machine. Von Stromberg had learned of his escape, and with a perfect intuition was coming here, directly and fast. The sound of the shots had been heard. There was no time to lose. Hammersley bent over the man on the ground and searched his pockets rapidly. Gloves, matches, a spark plug, tobacco, but no papers. The chauffeur, of course. By main strength, he lifted the dead weight of the man in the car and carried him down into the glare of the searchlight. It was a dangerous thing to do, for the lights of the machine from Blaufelden were already swinging through the tree trunks. But he worked quickly and skillfully, tearing open the officer's gray overcoat and searching his pockets. In the inside pocket of his uniform he found them, a bulky package and other papers. He read the superscription quickly. Sein Exzellenz General Graf von Stromberg, then sprang aside out of the glare of the lights at the very moment when the other machine came swinging rapidly around the turn in the road. The papers are safe? Roared a voice which Hammersley recognized. Ja, Hammersley replied in a rough tone. A man tried to stop me and I shot him. Ganz gut. He is here, shouted Hammersley again. All the while he had been moving out of the glare of the searchlights, and as the men from the other car tumbled out and came forward, he turned into the darkness and, abandoning all caution, took to his heels and ran at top speed in the opposite direction. Behind him he heard shouts as his trick was discovered, but he knew that in the matter of speed he had nothing to fear afoot from any German at LINDBERG. The thing that bothered him now was a way to hide the marks of his footsteps, for in places the mud was soft and he knew that in the morning light they would follow him. So he picked his way carefully, running at top speed for a mile at least, to lead the pursuit away from the THORWALD, and then at the banks of a small stream paused a moment and listened. He had eluded them. Then without hesitation, though puffing fearfully from his exertions, he stepped down into the cold waters of the stream and waded up it, avoiding the ledges and making sure that he left no mark behind him. As he climbed higher up the mountain, he could see in the distance the glow of the lights of the machines, and when he reached a mossy bank which would not betray him, he clambered out of the water and turned, doubling like a fox upon his trail, turning back in the general direction from which he had come. Doris worried him. He could imagine her crouching there 200 feet in the air just above the two machines, half dead with fear of capture and terror for him. Had she seen what had happened and understood it? Would she have the kind of silent endurance to crouch there and wait? He hurried on into the maze of the rocks and deep woods, finding at last a deer trail that he knew. There were but two means of ingress to the cave of the Thorwald, one by the secret path in the bushes up the rocks, which Doris had taken, the other from the upper side, which he was now rapidly approaching. He ran along the deer trail, reloading his automatic as he went, his eyes peering ahead for familiar landmarks, cutting in at last to the left at a great rock around which the deer trail led. He now proceeded with great caution. Far below him he could see the reflections of the lights of the two cars and heard the voices of men. He went down a way toward the wall of rocks, clambering over huge boulders, hauling himself here and there by the aid of tree limbs, reaching at last the dry bed of the old stream which down in the road had been of such assistance to him. Now the wall of rock rose sheer before him. He stole cautiously along its face, feeling with his hands and peering upward. In a moment he found what he was looking for, a small projecting ledge which he mounted and followed to his right for a way, then mounting again by easy stages to a fissure wider than his body, which he entered and followed quickly. It led downward, it seemed, into the bowels of the crag, but came out suddenly into an open space, a kind of amphitheater, with a ridge of rock upon one side and upon the other what appeared to be a solid wall. He crossed this space quickly and peered over. Below him the crag jutted out over the road, and upon it somewhere was Doris. He strained his gaze downward but could not see her. What if they had found her footsteps and followed? No, that was hardly possible, for the ridge of rocks began immediately at the road, and thanks to his precautions, she would leave no footprints. Slowly he descended, choosing his footing with quick deliberation, for the slightest sound, the dislodging of a twig or a sliver of crumbled stone, and the crag of the Thorwald would become in a moment a hornet's nest. Fortunately, the back of the rock screened him from the road, and unless von Stromberg had sent men into the woods to left and right, there was no chance of discovery. At last he reached the level, and a dark shadow rose at his very feet and silently clasped his hand. He took her in his arms for a moment in devout thankfulness. If the true moment of their mating had been back there in the road, while danger threatened them before and behind, this place of security was the beginning of its consummation. He did not speak and only motioned her to sit while he crouched beside her, waiting. Below in the road, he heard the rasping voice of His Excellenz, speaking in no gentle tones to the wounded chauffeur of the messenger's machine, asking question after question which were answered feebly enough. After a while, the men who had followed Hammersley returned and made their reports. The dull boom of the voice of Wentz and the harsh crackle of von Stromberg's in rage and mortification. "He got away, Excellenz," said Wentz. "For a moment only I saw him and followed fast as I could, but my legs are too short." "Bah! You are an imbecile, Herr Hauptmann, and the other men. Are not their legs longer?" "Yes, but Herr Hammersley has the legs of a deer. They are following, but it is like hunting for a grain of barley in a coal scuttle. He may have taken to the woods anywhere." "Ja, but the Fräulein, she could not have run as fast as he." "It is my opinion," said Wentz with some temerity, "that they had a rendezvous somewhere beyond. He has known these mountains since his boyhood." "Esel, but she hasn't. And how should she find it in the dark?" Perhaps the matter being so important, he would have deserted her. Quatsch! Find me the girl, and I will find you Hammersley. Hammersley felt Doris's clasp tighten on his own. She cannot have gotten far away. Search for her, Schafskopf. Search the woods and rocks until morning. Take the other machine and follow his footsteps until you see them no more. Then follow his trail in the woods. Take the 2 Försters with you. I will go back to Blaufelden and send for more men and question the guards who permitted his escape. Go!" The fugitives sat silently listening to the sounds below them and heard the orders to put the wounded man and the dead messenger into the machine, and presently the commotion of departure as the machines were backed away from the gully, turned in available spots, and then departed in opposite directions. General von Stromberg's at full speed, the other slowly, while Captain Wentz walked on before, his shoulders bent, trying to follow the signs of Hammersley's rubber soles in the road. But it had begun to rain steadily again, and Hammersley was thankful, for it would not be long before all marks of his footsteps would be erased. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. The cave on the Thorwald. Safe? He heard her whisper. Yes, for the present. You have what you came for? I think so. And what shall we do now? Sleep. You're dead beat. Come. He rose and helped her to her feet, then after another pause, turned toward the wall of rocks behind them. Do you think you can make it? It's a difficult climb. Yes, I've that much left in me. You lead the way and I'll follow. Her teeth were chattering. As he touched her sleeve, he found it soaked with moisture. Poor child, you're nearly frozen. He had not been conscious of the occasional spatter of rain, for his leather jacket had kept him dry. But I'll have you warm and snug before you can say knife. And when she questioned, "A fire," he replied. "Isn't that what one uses to get warm with? But here, tonight? Oh, don't bother. You'll see." They were climbing up the face of the slippery rocks, Hammersley pausing from time to time to let her rest, pulling her from above when he reached the ledges, and at last they came out into the amphitheater of boulders from which he had descended. She was almost too weary for comment and followed blindly as he led her to the wall of the rock where he seemed to disappear in its very face. She followed him inside a dark opening, and when they were well within, he relinquished her hand and struck a match. A brief glimpse she had of a small chamber in the cliff, not 20 feet square, when the match went out. He struck another, and shading it with his hand, went forward. She saw him find what he was looking for, and in a moment a candle, after faintly sputtering for a moment, sent forth a steady glow of light. "Sit here on this stool. I'll have you right in a jiffy." She obeyed him and looked around her. At one side was a bed of pine needles, at another a small table, and in the middle of the rocky floor the gray embers of what had been a fire. "A bit roguish, but not so bad?" She nodded while he busied himself in building the fire. There were dry leaves, twigs, and logs in the corner, and soon a blaze was leaping cheerfully upward. And while she wondered at the signs of occupancy, he answered her thought. "It's LINDBERG's. He comes here often. It was here that he and I always slept when we went on hunting trips. You see, there's a natural chimney overhead in the rocks where the bally smoke goes out. They might observe the smoke by day, but at night we're quite safe. I've been all around the place when the fire was going, and there isn't a sign of it outside." He helped her put her coat off and made her comfortable close to the fire, after which he quickly took the package of papers out of his pocket and examined them. The single papers were military orders of no importance to one Lieutenant Ortsman, obviously the dead messenger. Hammersley put them aside, breaking the seal of the heavy envelope and examining its contents carefully. First, a letter of instructions to His Excellency von Stromberg, signed in the bold hand of the Emperor of Germany himself. He showed her the signature and explained its contents, and all thought of weariness went from her mind. It's what you came for? Yes, he replied, smiling grimly. I've got it. It isn't so important that you can't tell me? She asked timidly. He laughed, put his arm around her, and held her for a moment tenderly. She had endured where a man might have flinched, and yet at this moment she was all woman, timid, weary unto death, but still curious. It was the master impulse. No, he smiled. You've jolly well earned the right to know. I'll tell you. He was so big, so strong, so certain of himself that she wondered how, for a moment even, she could have thought him other than he was. With a sudden impulse of pride and tenderness, she rose, put her arms around his neck and, bending his head down to hers, kissed him upon the lips. He caught her to him and held her in his arms. "Oh, Cyril," she murmured, "that I could ever have failed in my belief in you. That I could ever have thought that you were false. Why didn't you tell me the truth? I would have kept your secret." "It was impossible, dear. It was too big a thing and I was sworn to silence. But since you found out." "Did you think me curious?" she asked naively, "because I read the cigarette papers?" "Curious?" he laughed. "Well, rather. The mistake I made was in telling you not to read them. If I..." "Don't laugh at me," she whispered. "I can't stand that. The only retribution for what I did this afternoon is a blow. If you struck me, Cyril, I should not care." "But I won't, you know, old girl. But I'm going to kiss you again, if you don't mind." And he did, while a shadow darkened her eyes. "It seems terrible to be happy, even in our moment of security, with the shadow of death hanging so closely over us. I know you had to kill him, Cyril, but..." She paused. "It was either that or he would have killed me. As it was too jolly close a thing for comfort. I gave the other man his chance, but he wouldn't take it. Lucky he didn't, for I might have missed the papers." She clung to him more closely. "And if you had been killed," she whispered, "I saw it all. At first I thought you had fallen. Oh, Cyril, the agony of it. And then you came out from behind the tree and I knew that you were unharmed. I had seen a man die, as I had, there upon the rocks at Bennekield. But when the other one came at you, I wanted you to kill him. I wanted it. I prayed that you would. It was murder. In my heart, I can't understand how I have changed. And I've always thought death such a fearsome thing." She hid her face in his shoulder and clung to him trembling. She had passed through danger valiantly, carelessly even, but now that for the moment danger had passed, woman-like, she yielded to the reaction. He kissed her gently. "Shh, child, don't let it work on you. No bally use. We're safe now." "Yes, safe for the present. That ought to be enough for me. But if anything had happened to you..." She shuddered. "But it didn't." "Oh, I'm thankful," she whispered. "Thankful for that and for you. The trouble I've passed through, the pain of my thoughts of you. I'm thankful for those too, because without them I never should have known you. The real you, Cyril. I sometimes think that life deals too easily with most of us to bring out the best that's in us. I never would have known you in England, Cyril, doing the things you always did." He smiled at her. "I'm the same chap, though." Can't tell what a fellow will do when he has to." "But you didn't have to. You might have gone to France and sat in a trench. Instead of that, you did what was harder. Let them distrust you, hold you in contempt, keeping silent and cheerful while you were doing such splendid things for England." She paused while she caressed him and said in a proud whisper, "The Honorable Cyril." "Honorable," he smiled. "You'd hardly get von Stromberg to think that." "That terrible old man," she went on, clinging to him. "I can see his vulture face now. He would have shot you tomorrow. But we fooled him, what?" "Poor Lindberg." She questioned him and he told her of the devotion of his old friend. "And what will von Stromberg do to Lindberg?" she asked anxiously. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Nothing, perhaps, unless Udo tells." He paused and looked into the fire. "Wish I knew about Udo," he said thoughtfully. "We were very good pals last year." "But he wouldn't see you shot." "He couldn't do anything. I'm betraying his country." "But not your country, Cyril," she said. "No, thank God, not mine. I love Germany, the Germany of my mother and the men like Lindberg. But the Germany of von Stromberg, that's not Germany to me." "Do you think we will get away?" "Yes," he said quickly. She read the anxiety in his voice and knew that he was thinking of her. And in that moment a new idea of her duty came to her. "You mean," she said quickly, "that you could get away if it wasn't for me. Oh, Cyril, I know. Don't try to deceive me. You could disguise yourself and get away to the Swiss border. It would not be difficult for you. I am a weight around your neck which may destroy you." "Hush, child. No, I am not too stupid to see that. You ought to be going now." She clung to his arms and looked up into his face as her duty came more clearly to her, while her voice trembled with earnestness. "I want you to go, Cyril. Your life is valuable to England. They are on a false scent down there. You could get away in the darkness, and by morning you can be miles away. I'm not afraid. Tomorrow I can go and give myself up. I'm only a girl, an American. They will not dare to harm me. Don't smile. I am in deadly earnest. You must go, Cyril. Now, now." But he only patted her gently. "You think that I am a child," she went on, "that I cannot be trusted to get along alone. Haven't I proved it to you that I am not afraid? Look at me, Cyril. I am only a little tired now, but tomorrow I will go to von Stromberg and say, 'Here I am. Now, what can you do to me?' He may threaten and bluster and rage, but that will not frighten me when you are safe." What can he reply? What could he do? My nation is not at war with his. He would not dare. Oh, Cyril, say that you'll go. Say that you'll go." She looked up into his face and saw that its expression had not changed. He was still smiling at her softly while she felt the touch of his fingers gently petting her. "Oh, you won't go. You won't," she cried, and then without further warning burst into a passion of tears. "Don't, Doris, for God's sake," he whispered. "Don't break now. I need all your courage and your strength. You've been so brave, so strong. Keep up your spirits. There's a dear. We'll pull through. Don't you worry. They'll take you if you stay here. No, they won't find us. I'm not afraid of that. And there are water and biscuits here. We'll take things easy for a while and then slip off. Do you think I could go and leave you in the lurch? Pretty sort of Johnny I'd be to do a thing like that." "Not for 20 Englands, Doris," he whispered, kissing her tenderly. "Not for 20 Englands. I wouldn't." His touch soothed her and she grew more quiet. Of course you wouldn't," she murmured. But I wish you would." Her hands met around his neck and he raised her chin and kissed her on the mouth. It was a kiss of plighted troth, of tenderness, faith, and the exalted passion that comes with tears. "Mated?" he whispered. "Yes, yes," she murmured faintly. They did not move for a long moment when Doris slowly disengaged her arms from around his neck and moved slightly away. Her hair had fallen and hung in golden disorder about her shoulders. She put up her arm, trying to catch the escaping pins, and then she smiled at him, dimpling adorably. "Come," he said gently. "You must get to bed. Your coat is nearly dry, but I'll cover you with my jacket. You must sleep too. No shamming, you know. Can't tell what may happen tomorrow." "I'll try," she murmured obediently, while he led her to the couch of boughs and made her lie on it. But as he knelt beside her, covering her with his jacket, she caught his hands and would not relinquish them. He raised hers to his lips and kissed them again and again. Small, muscular hands they were, but now very brown and dirty. "Are you comfortable? Sorry I haven't a tub." She was silent a moment and then straightened and asked him, "You promised to tell me about the papers, won't you?" He laughed. "Not now. It must be nearly morning." "Yes, now. I'm not tired now. I will sleep afterwards. I like to hear your voice, Cyril. Maybe it will soothe me to sleep." "Are you sure?" he asked doubtfully, and she nodded. He saw that she was still nervous and wakeful, and sank beside her couch, taking her hand in his. "It is really quite interesting," he began slowly. 3 years ago, at the invitation of the Emperor of Germany, when Europe was at peace and there was no cloud upon the horizon bigger than a chap's hand, there met in a shooting lodge near Schöndorf, not 10 miles from here, 6 men. It was a secret conference arranged by the Emperor of Germany through His Excellency Graf von Stromberg. The 6 men were His Highness Prince von Waldheim, at one time Germany's ambassador to France, Admiral von Frankenhausen, head and front of the Imperial German Navy, General von Sandersdorf, the brains of the German General Staff, His Excellency Moritz von Komarum, Minister of War of the Austrian Empire, Viscount Melbourne, English Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and Harlow Gordon of the British Admiralty. She was listening avidly, wide-eyed, the array of well-known names telling her as nothing else could have done the importance of the conference. "This meeting was a secret," he went on. "These men all traveled incognito, without servants, and were met by an agent of General von Stromberg at Schöndorf and conducted in automobiles to the hunting lodge I have spoken of. These men remained there for 2 days and 2 nights, then went home. But while they were there, they were making new history for Europe." He paused to fill his pipe, but her curiosity could not be restrained. "And what were they doing there, Cyril? I can't understand." Hammersley got up and held his pipe to the candle, for matches were scarce, and then, with maddening calmness, sat beside her again. "That secret meeting of these chaps had to do with nothing less than the ruin of France." "France?" she cried. "England had nothing against France, and now she is her ally." 3 years ago, the political conditions were different," he answered. "Those representatives of England came and sat with representatives of Germany and Austria while they plotted the destruction of France." "But how do you know this, Cyril? I can't understand. No more do I. But it's a fact. Let me go on. At the table in the lodge where this conference was held, Viscount Melbourne made notes of what was going on, including the combinations of land and naval forces that could be made against France and Russia, and the plans to break the Russian Federation in the Balkans. When the meeting was over, all the scraps of paper these chaps had scribbled on were destroyed by fire before the eyes of the men who had made 'em, except those of Viscount Melbourne, who put 'em in his pocket, and with them a pencil copy of this secret treaty in his own handwriting. The original copy of the treaty was entrusted to Harlow Gordon, who put it in his dispatch box. It was not until the next day, when the Englishmen in the train on the way to Paris discovered that Viscount Melbourne's private papers were missing. Jolly fine mess, what? They got off at the next stop, went back to Schöndorf and looked for the papers, but neither there nor at the lodge was there hair or hide of them. So they went back to England, hoping that by some fortunate accident the papers had been destroyed. And these? Asked the girl. Are they? He nodded. To make the story short, I found out where they had gone. My flights to Germany have been made for this purpose. Don't you see? The papers came into the hands of the Emperor of Germany, and he was planning to have them sent to the President of the French Republic, England's ally. It wouldn't do, you know, to have such papers at such a time fall into the hands of France. Hardly a credit to English diplomacy, what? Might even result in a new entente. But where were the papers in the meanwhile? She asked. That is what took me so bally long to find out. After many hunts away from LINDBERG at night, I traced him to a socialist by the name of Gottschalk at Schöndorf, who had received them from a pensioner of the Imperial Forest Service, one of the attendants at the hunting lodge where the conference was held. Whether he found them or stole them, I don't know, but I frightened him and he confessed. I was on the very point of stealing him from Gottschalk when I found out that he had been writing to the Wilhelmstrasse, and when I tried to get him, they were gone. If I'd got him, then you would not be here, Doris, and I. But how did you learn what the Wilhelmstrasse proposed to do with them? Oh, that was quite clear. The English Foreign Office had been badly frightened and has used every effort with its secret agents in Berlin to get that information. It reached London the other day, and just before I left Scotland, I knew the job was to be given to General von Stromberg. The rest was kismet, the fortune of war, a jolly good piece of luck. Lindberg overheard through the microphone von Stromberg giving instructions to Wentz so that His Excellency's own weapons were turned against him. I was going to waylay Wentz on the way to France, but circumstances prevented. It was I, Cyril, she broke in pleadingly. I didn't know. I betrayed you. A trick, he laughed, invented in the Ramses family, but still useful. He frightened me, she stammered. I believe the message signed Maxwell. Genuine. Not Maxwell, he said gravely. For Maxwell, a sore spot since the war began in the side of the War Office. Maxwell is dead. You? She exclaimed fearfully. Yes, he replied. I told them and they caught him. I couldn't do so before. It's war, Doris. It is a fair game. I ask no favors, nor do I give any. She was silent a moment, looking into the fire. Yes, I understand. A terrible game with odds against. And after a pause, You say that we will get away. Won't you tell me your plan?" He rose with a confident laugh. "Yes, I have a plan, but I'm not going to tell it now. You're going to sleep." She laughed wearily and sat up. "And you? Where will you sleep?" "By the fire. I've got some thinking to do. I'm not sleepy. I had 8 hours last night. I'm going to watch." He bent over her and gently made her lie down. "I will talk to you no more. You must go to sleep." She sighed and stretched herself out while he covered her with his coat. Then he put a fresh log on the fire and sat beside her again. In a moment he heard her voice. "I hope you don't mind my telling you, Cyril, that I love you a great deal." "Not in the least," he whispered. "I wouldn't mind listening while you said it all night. But there, you're going to insist on my sleeping again, won't you?" "I don't seem to feel as if I could ever sleep again. You're so cool, so calm, Cyril. How can you be?" "No bally use getting excited. Here we're snug as two bugs in a rug. We'll slip through them some way." "But where will we go?" He smiled. "I have a notion of going to England." His kind of quiet humor always put her on her mettle. "To England?" She started up. "There won't be much chance of you doing anything tomorrow if you don't get your sleep," he insisted gently. "Do what I ask, Doris. Sleep you must." "I'll try. Good night, Cyril. Good night." He kissed her on the forehead and drew his jacket over her again, then sat beside her, her hand in his, watching. Gradually her nerves grew quiet and weariness mastered her. He waited until her breathing indicated sleep, when he carefully relinquished her hand and moved to the fire, where he carefully studied the papers by the light of his candle. After which he slipped them into the pocket of his trousers and moved softly across the cave into a corner where he opened the lid of a tin box and examined its contents, taking out a fresh candle to replace the other one, which was on the point of expiring. Then he filled his pipe with great deliberateness and, returning the stool by the fire, crossed his knees and bent forward, gazing into the blaze, his brows tangled in deep thought. He had succeeded in getting what he came for. So far, the secret of the meeting in the shooting lodge was safe. But for how long? By this time, a description of the two of them had, of course, been telegraphed to every village and military station in Germany. That wouldn't do at all. Alone it might be managed, with a German officer's uniform and Herr Lieutenant Ortsmann's military orders, but with Doris it wasn't to be thought of. The other alternative appealed to him more strongly. He had matched his wits against von Stromberg's so far and had won, and success made him hopeful. Where carelessness failed, audacity sometimes succeeded. The more he thought of his plan, the deeper became his conviction that it was the only one possible under the circumstances. There was continued danger for the papers, and he deliberated for a long while upon the wisdom of destroying them at once, finally rejecting that idea except as a last alternative. His word that he had destroyed them would perhaps be sufficient to ease the minds of the gentlemen at the Foreign Office. But there were certain memoranda about the promises of Germany to England, signed with the initials of Prince von Waldheim, which should at all costs be saved. But aside from this consideration, Hammersley, having carried his affairs thus far successfully, had a pride in finishing it as he had planned. It could be done. He would do it. He got up and put another log on the fire and then stretched himself out at full length upon the rocks, gazing into the flame. In the corner where the bed was, he heard the steady breathing of the girl. What a trump she was. What a He nodded and then dozed. Troubled visions flitted across his mind. Once he thought he heard the sound of a footstep on the rocks and started up. It was broad daylight. He listened for a while and then slowly sank back and slept again. How long he did not know, for something awakened him and he sat up, reaching instinctively for the holster lying at his side, to look straight into the muzzle of an automatic, behind which was the handsome blonde head of Udo von Winden. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. The fight in the cavern. Udo loomed against the light, and the uniform he wore seemed to give the projecting weapon a new significance. He was not Udo, the kinsman and companion who had so often shared this refuge with Hammersley in the hunting days. He was Germany. Hammersley could never remember the time when the muzzle of a weapon had seemed so large. It was much better to sit without moving, and Udo's quick instructions were not wasted. "Don't move, Cyril," he said coolly in German. "Up with your hands. So. Now, get up, leaving your belt where it is, and sit on the stool yonder. Quickly, I will shoot to kill." Hammersley read in his expression a determination to put the threat into practice and, watching narrowly, silently obeyed. Von Winden, still covering him carefully, picked up the belt and transferred LINDBERG's pistol to his own holster. He was a dead shot with any firearm, as Hammersley knew, and his own chances at 3 paces, even in a rush, were small. It was decidedly a case for discretion. "I suppose there's nothing to be said," Hammersley muttered. "You outguessed me, Udo." And then, to gain a moment of time, "I thought that your memory might be quite good enough to forget the Thorwald." Von Winden frowned down the barrel of the automatic. "It is too much to expect, even from me," he said crisply. "I am your kinsman, but I am first of all a German, and not even for you will I be a traitor." "Natürlich," smiled Cyril. Udo von Winden's look was grave, his voice sober, and the muzzle of his automatic did not waver. "I have already had a bad memory, my cousin. This afternoon I forgot that LINDBERG, who served your meals, was a good friend of yours and mine, and that he might be counted on to help you out of your difficulties. I also forgot that there was such a place as the cave of the Thorwald, until I learned from Excellence last night the price Germany was to pay for my indifference. If you had failed to capture the documents of His Majesty, I might have remained silent. As you took them, there remained nothing but to act. I came here, for I knew it would be the one place where I should find you." Hammersley bent his head. "I understand." And then quickly, "Would you mind telling me, if you have spoken, if you have told what LINDBERG?" "No," von Winden broke in. "I have told nothing. LINDBERG is safe. I come here alone." Hammersley gave a gasp of relief and leaned forward, peering into the fire. "I came for one purpose, Cyril," Udo went on quietly. "I have no personal desire for your death." But I would kill you as you sit rather than see Germany suffer the loss of the documents in your possession. I came for them, and I intend that you shall give them to me." Hammersley looked up into his cousin's face, and their eyes met. Von Winden's tone was cool and his manner as calm as on the days last year when they were hunting together. But Hammersley knew that when Udo von Winden was most calm, he was also most dangerous. So he slowly reached into the pocket of his trousers and handed his cousin the papers he had taken from the German messenger. "Danke," said Udo, backing to the light of the entrance of the cave to examine them. "You are sure they are all here?" "My word on it, Udo," said Hammersley frankly. He watched his cousin examine the documents and heard him give an exclamation of satisfaction. But Hammersley saw that his eyes neglected no detail of the cavern and was aware that the muzzle of the weapon in Udo's hand still bore directly upon him. In the shadows Hammersley saw the face of Doris, who was sitting up pallid and dark-eyed as though awakened from one nightmare into another. As Udo saw her, the muzzle of his weapon wavered and went out of alignment, but Hammersley did not move or even appear to notice the girl. There was a note of embarrassment in the German officer's voice as he spoke again. "I am sorry, my cousin, that your father's blood called you to be false to Germany. You had been suspected by Excellenz, but I would have sworn that he was mistaken. You owe me nothing, of course, but it's war, Udo," said Hammersley quietly. "You will remember that I did not seek duty in the Imperial Secret Service. It was the Herr General who thought it valuable to use our kinship for his own purposes." Udo shrugged. "Yes, I know," he said quietly. "You have done your duty. But you must now be aware of the fact that you can ask no favors of me. I don't. I am in your power. Shoot me if you like." Udo smiled. "I can hardly be expected to do that. I do not love you now, my cousin. I cannot love anyone who is false to my country. But I cannot forget that once, not a year ago, we were brothers. No, I cannot shoot you, Cyril, though perhaps that would be a better death than that other yonder." Hammersley shrugged. "It is the fortune of war. From your point of view, I deserve it. I can only thank you again, for myself and for Miss Mather, for your generosity." A sound from the girl, and Udo acknowledged her presence by a bow. "Under other circumstances," he said with stiff politeness, "I should be glad to extend the hospitalities of Winden Schloss. But of course, as Miss Mather can see, my mother and sisters are away and I—" "Of course, Graf von Winden. It is understood," she said haltingly in German. "I can do nothing, Fräulein. I am powerless. At the orders of General von Stromberg, who arranges the coming and the going of all at Windenberg. The coming, Udo," said Hammersley dryly, "not the going. I am sorry. I have done what I could. You have done well to give me the papers. I shall now go back to Blaufelden and return them to Excellenz." Hammersley started up. "You mean that you will leave us here?" "Natürlich. I do not wish to see you killed against the kitchen wall. It is not the death for the blood of von Eppingen. Even if you are shot while escaping, it would be better." He shrugged. "My position is this. You can do Germany no further harm. I shall tell a likely story. I have the papers. They are what I came for. If you had not given them to me, I would have killed you. But now I shall go away alone as I came." Good old Udo, said Hammersley impulsively, taking a pace toward him, his hand outstretched. But von Winden's automatic came quickly into line and Hammersley halted. One moment, my cousin, said von Winden coolly. I am quite willing to accept your expressions of gratitude from a distance. I may not wish to see you killed by others, and I would regret the necessity of killing you myself. I shall consider you my prisoner until I go. After that, and he shrugged expressively, you can go where you like. Hammersley folded his arms and frowned. Where I like, he muttered, with every village in Hesse Nassau on the lookout for me. There was a pause, after which von Winden spoke with quiet earnestness. Unfortunately, I may not help you further. Since there is food, to wait here is safer. Alone, traveling by night, a man might reach Basel safely. As for the Fräulein, if she will return to Blaufelden and give herself up, imprisonment for a time is perhaps the worst that she need fear. Doris had risen, the white light from the door of the cavern searching her face pitilessly. It is what I would do, she said haltingly, what I have pleaded with him to let me do. Cyril, she implored in English, you must let me. I will think about it, he muttered. You're sure that no harm will come to her? The muzzle of the automatic had wavered out of line again, and Hammersley was carefully measuring with his eye the distance that separated him from his cousin. The bark of excellence is much worse than his bite. He will bluster and storm, but eventually he will return Miss Mather to her own people. Hammersley was shaking his head in indecision. I am not so sure that I agree with you about the bite of excellence. I shall think of what I will do. I'm sure of one thing, Udo, he said with sincerity, that I am deeply grateful for what you have done. The war has made us enemies, and you have now prevented the success of my great venture. But I bear you no ill will. The debt is still mine on account of your silence. Back there, a debt made deeper by the presence of Fräulein Mather. He paused to give his words effect. I had not told you, Udo, for at LINDBERG one has no time to think of the gentler things of life. But just before the war broke out, Fräulein Mather had promised me to become my wife. Hammersley watched von Winden as he turned toward Doris with a smile, bowing deeply, his sense of the situation lost for a second in the obligations of civility, as he murmured a phrase of congratulations. I am much honored by your confidences, he said formally, and I deeply regret. He got no further, for Hammersley had sprung in suddenly toward him, risking Udo's shot, which was fired quickly without aim. A furious struggle followed. Hammersley caught at von Winden's wrist and his weight bore him back against the rock, while both of them fought for the possession of the weapon. The German officer was smaller than his cousin, but his wrists were good and he was quicker than Hammersley. They bore only friendship for each other, but the incentive of each was greater even than hatred could have been. They struggled in silence, the thought of the possession of the papers uppermost in the minds of both. The struggle was not that of kinsman against kinsman, but of England against Germany. Realizing the desperateness of Hammersley's attack and the purpose of it, von Winden knew that a victory for Hammersley meant the loss of the papers, and so he was bent on killing his cousin if he could, Hammersley on preventing him from doing so. They swayed from side to side, breathing hard, while Doris crouched against the side of the cavern, dumb with terror. Twice she saw the weapon in the German officer's hand point downward toward Cyril's back, and then, before it could be used, saw Cyril's arm quickly push it upward. She knew that she was in danger, but she did not know what to do. At one moment von Winden seemed to have the advantage, and in another Cyril. Udo's back was against the wall, and one of Cyril's arms was around him, while their legs were intertwined as each tried to get the other off his balance. Suddenly, with an effort, Hammersley managed to wrench the pistol from von Winden's hand, and he tossed it into the corner of the cavern. Von Winden had every ethical right to kill Hammersley if he could. But after what his cousin had done for him, Hammersley could not kill Udo. That was impossible. He must succeed without that. This generosity nearly proved fatal to him, for the German managed to reach Hammersley's automatic in his own holster and had almost disengaged it when Hammersley caught his hand again, and the struggle was renewed. But Doris, whose senses and initiative had slowly returned to her, now crept around the walls of the cave, and when von Winden's outstretched hand came within her reach, she seized his forearm in both of her hands and clung to it desperately, keeping the muzzle pointed away from Cyril. She was swayed to and fro with the struggling men, who finally toppled sideways and fell to the floor, dragging her with them. But von Winden's grasp of the weapon, never quite secure, was loosened, and as they dropped, it went flying under the table. The fight was soon out of the German, for Hammersley's weight had fallen on him heavily, and in a moment the officer was flat on his back and Hammersley was sitting on him. Doris, who had meanwhile picked up the pistol, now heard Hammersley gasping jerkily. "Quick, Doris! Something to tie with! Your stay strings!" She understood and disappeared outside the cavern, returning presently with the bonds, helping Cyril while he made the wrists and ankles of von Winden fast. "I might have killed you, but I didn't," Hammersley was gasping. "You saw that, Udo, didn't you? You needn't make apologies. I would have killed you. I tried to. It's too bad. Too bad," he panted. "I'm sorry," Hammersley repeated. "Those papers, they're England's, Udo. They're my property. I've got to take them." And without further words, he put his hand inside the breast of the officer's coat and took the papers out. "I wish it were anybody but you," he said. "I don't think you can get away with them. I'm going to try. I'll prevent you if I can. How?" "I'll show you." And with the remnants of his breath, he shouted lustily for help. Hammersley threw him back none too gently and clapped a handkerchief in his mouth, while he directed Doris to tear her underskirt and make bandages for a gag. They worked quickly, and in a moment the German officer was silent and helpless. Then for a long moment Hammersley sat by the prostrate man, slowly recovering his breath. Doris, ash gray with fear, crouched beside him, obedient to his look and action. At last, with a laugh, he got up. "Close thing that," he said. "My word, it nearly got me." And then with a look at the prostrate man, "Poor old Udo." In a moment, with a word to Doris, he went outside the cave and listened intently. He peered cautiously over the ridge of rocks. The road was deserted. The sound of the shot, while it had seemed deafening, would have been muffled at the entrance of the cavern and could not have been heard from a distance. And when Hammersley returned, he reassured Doris as to the immediate danger of discovery. "There is no hurry, Doris. I must think," he said, filling his pipe. He stood upright for a while, puffing rapidly, peering down at the captive, his expression struggling between a frown and a smile. Herr Graf Udo von Winden looked so very much like a mummy. The eyes of his cousin, the only visible part of his face, followed Hammersley intently. "I could have done for you, Udo," Hammersley repeated. "I want to be sure that you understand that." Von Winden's head moved ever so slightly. Doris had sunk upon the stool, her face buried in her hands. "Oh, it's cruel," she murmured. "Let him go, Cyril." "Hardly," said Hammersley coolly. "He'd raise a rumpus, wouldn't you, Udo?" The officer's head did not move. "You see," said Hammersley, "but I'm going to make him as comfortable as possible." And taking him by the armpits, he dragged his cousin over to the corner and laid him gently on the bed of balsam, and then stood beside the bed, looking down at him thoughtfully, addressing him impersonally in English, as though thinking aloud. "What's to become of you when we go, old chap? That's what's bothering me now." The German's shoulders moved slightly. "Oh, that's all very well, but I can't leave you up here to rot my cousin. No one knows the way to the crag of the Thorwald. You might be here 1,000 years if LINDBERG shouldn't come." Von Winden made no sign. It was obvious that he had no further intention of helping in the solution of the difficulty. "Let me stay here with him, Cyril," Doris was pleading. Again. "It can do me no harm. And when you are well on your way, I will release him and go back to Blaufelden. I can't take that chance. You're going with me." "Where?" "To England." "But how?" "Leave that to me. At present we must have breakfast. Do you know, it's almost 10 o'clock." Bewildered, she watched him go to the large tin box in the corner of the cavern, from which he brought forth some dry salt biscuit and several pieces of chocolate. "It isn't much, but it's the best I can do. There's tea too, but I don't dare light a fire." She ate slowly at first, for the food seemed to choke her, but she recalled the fact that except for 2 pieces of toast and the chocolate of von Stromberg, she had eaten nothing since yesterday morning. Cyril, who never seemed at a loss for anything, produced a metal pitcher and, going outside the cave for a moment, returned with it full of water. "Lindberg's," he said in reply to her question. "His food too. Good old Lindberg." He frowned and then went over to the prisoner. "You needn't tell me if you don't care to, Udo, but I'd like to know how Lindberg is. Will you answer me?" Von Winden nodded. "He is able to be about?" He nodded again. "Did His Excellency suspect?" He shook his head. "Thank God. Then Lindberg is at liberty?" Udo replied in the affirmative. Hammersley gave a gasp of relief. "That is well. I need not worry. He will come and release you." Von Winden only frowned. "Listen, Udo," went on Hammersley quickly. "Fräulein Mather and I are going down from here, leaving you alone. It can't be helped. You've stumbled up here and you've got to take your chance. In time, you may wear the strings through against the rock. If you don't return to Blaufelden by tomorrow, Lindberg will find you." "But suppose anything happened to Lindberg?" Doris was whispering. "Ah, Cyril, it would be terrible to leave him here. I should dream of it every night of my life." Udo's eyes smiled at her. "There is little danger. Graf von Winden is not a man to be so easily beaten. He will get away tonight. But in the meanwhile, we will have gone far enough to be out of his reach." "Where are we going?" "To England, child, and the Yellow Dove." He laughed. Doris started away from him, her eyes suddenly brilliant with excitement, and the prisoner, who had lain without movement, showed sudden signs of activity, his eyes frowning and his head wagging in anxiety. "He wants to speak," said Doris. Hammersley bent over his cousin. "Will you promise not to shout?" Von Winden nodded quickly, so Hammersley untied the bandages that held the handkerchief in the prisoner's mouth and helped him to a sitting posture. "You must not go," he stammered quickly in German. "It is impossible. You will fail. I warn you." "Why do you think so?" "The machines are guarded, and the spark plugs of your Taube have been removed and hidden." Said Hammersley thoughtfully. "Excellenz neglects nothing." "You would go to your death." "Perhaps. Thanks for the warning," said Hammersley bluntly. "I'm going just the same." Von Winden looked at him in amazement. "You do not believe me?" he asked. "It is the truth, I tell you." "I shall find a way." "But there is no way. You think that I am trying to persuade you to escape by the mountains so that you may be captured with the papers?" "Yes. I could not escape that way now. You know it." "Perhaps not. But what you plan is insane." "Fortune favors the fool. I've made up my mind." "Then you deserve to be shot," said Udo. "In the forest at least you would have a chance. Ah!" He gave a guttural exclamation and then, "Bind me and leave me. Then quickly. It's goodbye." "Goodbye, Udo," said Hammersley with a smile. "We'll meet again when Hesse-Nassau is an English province." "Bah, Cyril," said von Winden. "I have always said that you were a fool." Hammersley replaced the gag and bound it into place with great care, smiling the while. Then he removed the belt which contained his cousin's supply of cartridges and fastened it around his own body above Lindberg's, loading the two weapons with care and placing them in their holsters. Doris watched these preparations anxiously, but Hammersley made her eat her fill of chocolate and biscuits, and when they had finished, he went to the corner of the cavern and brought forth a large and heavy parcel, which he put on the table and opened. Doris saw that Captain von Winden was straightening on the couch, trying to see what it contained. Hammersley did not even glance in his direction. He seemed to know by instinct that Udo's curiosity had gotten the better of his dignity. He opened the package deliberately and spread the contents out upon the table. "Spare parts of the Taube, Udo. I've had 'em here for weeks. I'll let you have a peep at 'em if you like. A socket wrench, spark plugs, bolts, nuts and wire. By Jove, we might have used that on Udo." "You are afraid that what he says is true," whispered Doris anxiously. "Von Stromberg is prepared for you." "I wonder," he said. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. Hare and Hounds. For 2 hours or more, Hammersley and the girl, taking turn and turn, watched the road and forest from the amphitheater of rocks. The road in times of peace was a short route from Windenberg to Schöndorf and popular with the market folk. But the restrictions put upon visits to Blaufelden had resulted in the diversion of traffic from the south slope of the mountains to the longer road in the valley upon the other side. The few who appeared were men in uniform. From his lofty perch, Hammersley espied Captain Wentz as he hurried by with several men in an automobile. Just beyond the crag, the automobile was stopped and the men dismounted and went on afoot. Clearly they meant to continue the search abroad. Hammersley chuckled. "Hare and hounds," he muttered to himself. The more men to the eastward, the fewer to the west. By Jove! The expletive was not unusual with Hammersley, but the manner of its utterance gave it importance. He crossed the level quickly and peered again at the vanishing figures of the men. A new idea had been born. Hare and Hounds, a game he had played at Eton, a game as old as sport, as old as hunting, and for such a prize. He hurried into the cave, glancing hurriedly at his watch. It was noon. Doris sat upon the stool near Udo von Winden. Hammersley went over to their captive and examined his bonds, and then gave the girl a few hasty instructions. "I am going down below to be gone 2, perhaps 3 hours." A quick intake of the breath escaped her, but she caught her underlip in her teeth and said nothing. "Don't worry," he went on cheerfully. "I'm coming back, I'll promise you that. I've got a plan," he whispered. "A new plan. A noble plan. A plan that will make our game an easy one. It will be harder for you than for me, Doris, because you've only got to sit and wait and try to be patient." While he was talking, he had taken off the belts that contained the 2 pistols, fastening one around Doris. Then he took off his leather jacket and put it on the table, fastening the other belt containing Udo's cartridges and automatic over his gray sweater. She watched him timidly. "But suppose Graf von Winden should get his arms free," she protested. "I cannot shoot him, Cyril. I cannot. Not that. He won't trouble you. I'll arrange that." He took from his coat pocket the documents captured from the Emperor's messenger and held them up so that Udo von Winden could see them. "I must leave you for a while, Udo. Awfully sorry, but it's most urgent." He laughed. "You won't mind, will you? Or try to make things difficult?" He turned quickly, and while both the girl and the prisoner wondered what he was about to do, he went to the tin box in the corner, brought out a new candle, lighted it, and held the papers so that the prisoner could see them. "Do you observe what I'm doing, Udo? Miss Mather will sit here upon the opposite side of the cave. If you attempt to get up from your bed, she will burn the papers. Simple, isn't it? Also quite effective. She doesn't want to shoot you, Udo, nor do I. And of course, if the papers were burned, it wouldn't hurt England a great deal. As long as the papers are in Germany, my capture may throw them into German hands, nicht wahr?" Udo von Winden's head moved slightly from left to right. With an Auf Wiedersehen thrown over his shoulder at Udo, Hammersley went outside the cave, where Doris followed him. She was on the point of tears, but she succeeded in a smile. "Don't worry, Doris, old girl. Just going down for a stroll about." "But why, Cyril?" "Going to throw 'em off the scent," he whispered. "But they're already off the scent." For answer, he kissed her gently and bade her keep up her courage. Then he gave her the papers, saw her inside the cave again, and in a moment was gone. The more Hammersley thought of his plan, the better it seemed to him. The day was still young. In 3 hours he could do much. He crossed the amphitheater of rocks and followed the rocky gorge by which he had entered last night, and when he emerged upon the farther side, paused and watched for a while to be sure that Wentz and his men were not in sight, and then descended the face of the rocks skillfully, and in a moment was creeping on all fours through the underbrush up the side of the mountain. It was steep here and rugged, but in a while he reached the old deer trail over which he had passed when he had doubled on his pursuers last night. But instead of following it, he halted a moment to listen and then crossed into the undergrowth, which at this point was so thick that at 20 paces even he was not visible. He slipped among the tree trunks and evergreens, moving rapidly, making a wide circle up the mountainside almost to its top, descending then by easy stages until he had covered 4 miles at least, when he bore slowly down toward the Schöndorf road. Hare and hounds, an exciting game even in the old days when it meant athletic honors, but now, with the alternatives of death as the penalty of capture and a great triumph as the reward of escape, it made his blood run madly. A good game, a fair game, with success as the reward of intelligence. He planned carefully. He must be sure to come down into the open at a spot beyond where Wentz and his men were searching. He knew the country well. There was a village on the hillside half a mile below. It was midway between Schöndorf and the farmhouse at Blaufelden. The families of some of the foresters lived there, and there was telephonic connection both with the farm and LINDBERG. All of the men of Mittelwald who were not in the Forest Service were off at the front, and the chances were that unless Wentz and his men were there, Hammersley would see only women and children. But he knew that von Stromberg had neglected nothing that would give an inkling of his whereabouts, and his presence would be at once reported and the chase began. He was in excellent condition, trained a little too fine perhaps for an Englishman, but fit. He had done little running since leaving the university, and though he had lost some of his old speed, he could rely upon the thought of his danger and Doris's to provide the incentive for extraordinary effort. Mittelwald lay in a clearing similar to that at Blaufelden, and its farms, if farms they could be called, clambered up the hillside and straggled over beyond the road, where they were merged into the undergrowth of young oaks. The Schöndorf road, curving this way and that, passed between the houses, which were set at irregular intervals, like the strips on the tail of a kite. He went on through the underbrush, coming out into the open upon the road at the point where it entered the woods upon the Schöndorf side. Then he settled his automatic loosely in its sheath and went forward boldly. His eye had marked the line of the telephone wire and followed it to the gable of one of the largest houses in the village. It was to this house that he made his way. A young woman was working in the garden, and he approached her quietly and politely, but with an air of a man not to be trifled with, asked for food. He was aware that he was unshorn, covered with mud, and that his face was streaked with dirt and perspiration, but he knew that his appearance alone could not have accounted for the sudden blanching of the woman's face and the air of alarm with which she regarded him. She straightened and fell back 2 or 3 paces toward the house, unable to speak a word in reply. So he repeated his request while her mouth gaped at him and her eyes grew rounder. At last she managed to stammer, "Food." "You are hungry?" "Yes, potato bread, anything, but quickly. I will go with you to the house." And he indicated the way. She stumbled on before him, her head jerking anxiously this way and that over her shoulder, as though she feared at any moment to receive a blow or a shot in the back. But he followed her indoors and noted with satisfaction that she appeared after all to be a woman of some intelligence. A thing that pleased him further was the telephone instrument in the corner. "Milk, if you please, and quickly. I will take the bread with me." And while she timorously brought them out, "Who lives here?" "Förster Habermehl." "Where is he?" Peremptorily. "At Windenberg." "Oh, there are no men here?" "No." "That is well then." He drank a glass of milk greedily and tore off a piece of the loaf. "You're a good girl. Heaven will reward you." He made his way to the door, looking out cautiously, and then turned and put his hand in his pocket, bringing out a piece of money. "See," he laughed. "I have concluded to reward you myself. Cash, much better than hopes, nicht wahr?" She fetched a timorous smile and bobbed shyly. "You will do me a favor," he said in a whisper as he went out of the door. "If you will tell no one of my visit." And with that, chuckling to himself, went down the road again in the direction of Schöndorf, watching the turn in the road below the village for a glimpse of Wentz and his men. Before he reached the edge of the open country, he paused and listened. From the house that he had visited came the faint tinkle of a bell. Frau Habermehl had lost no time. She had notified the master of the hounds, who was clamoring for the scent. Hammersley walked around the turn in the road which hid him from the house, and then went into the bushes, where he sat on a fallen log, peeping through the leaves toward the further side of the clearing, where General von Stromberg's men must appear. He did not know how long he would have to wait. Half an hour, perhaps longer. If he knew anything of von Stromberg, they would come in every sort of available vehicle, from a high-powered machine to a donkey cart, picking up the misguided Wentz and his men upon the way to follow this new scent. It was difficult to sit still and wait. Hammersley wanted to smoke awfully, but he chewed a twig instead, for he needed to keep his wind in good condition and had purposely left his pipe at the Thorwald. He did not want to get too far away from Doris. By the way he intended to return, he was now at least 6 miles from the cavern, and with the mile or so he must go toward Schöndorf before he turned, a good 8 miles of rough going lay between himself and safety. Under other circumstances he would have greatly enjoyed the chance for a rest. With a cooler wind from the northeast, the weather had cleared and the period of higher temperatures through which they had passed seemed to be drawing to a close. In spite of the doubts that hung about his plan, he couldn't help saying to himself that he felt jolly fit. 20 minutes, 25, he got up and stretched his long limbs luxuriously. The hare was ready. It was time they cast forward the hounds. A peep through the bushes showed him Frau Habermehl standing near her home watching the road to Lindenberg. So he came out of his place of concealment and stood in the open again until he was sure that she saw him, when he turned and went slowly toward Schöndorf. He had planned his moment nicely, for before he was out of sight of the clearing, an automobile came into view, paused a moment before Frau Habermehl, and then came on rapidly. Hammersley waited until they had viewed him, and then cut into the woods to his left, slipping from tree to tree, not 50 yards in the cover, when the machine came to a stop and the men jumped down and came after him. He did not know who was in command and did not care, but just to show them that he was the man they were after, he risked a shot with his automatic and then sped along rapidly, working up the mountainside, following in a general way the direction of Schöndorf. He heard them plunging after him in full cry, and the sound of their footsteps made him move at a rare pace. He knew well this piece of woods, and in a moment came to a path which curved to the right, leading straight up the mountain. When he reached it, he paused to look over his shoulder. It was difficult to see the green uniforms, but there was a flash of light from a patch of fir trees, and a twig just above his head fell across his path. His curiosity was satisfied. He shut his mouth and, breathing through his nostrils, went off with a burst of speed which put him around a turn in the path before any of the green uniforms had come into sight. He had them coming now. 2, 3 men, one little one and 2 big ones. He caught a glimpse of them in a moment when the path came into a glade of rocks and barrens. There was his danger. A chance shot might get him when they emerged before he found the cover again. But leaping from rock to rock, he managed to reach the path upon the other side, and their shots went wild. When he reached cover, he halted a moment for a breath, firing a shot in the direction of the advancing men, who promptly dropped to cover. And when they came on again, he had gained a clear lead of 100 yards or more. He had foreseen his greatest danger of being caught in thick underbrush and surrounded, so he kept to the main path, only leaving it for a smaller and more tortuous one when the other turned down the mountain toward the road again. Since the exchange of shots, his pursuers had become more cautious, and when they reached the fork of the paths, they stopped, sweating in their heavy coats and cursing lustily while they debated upon the question as to which path he had taken. The hounds were at fault. From a point above he could see them quite clearly, and one of them was the fatalist who had been his jailer last evening. Just to discover whether he was sincere in his philosophy, Hammersley sent a bullet skipping above his head. He ducked, and Hammersley laughed. "Silly ass," he muttered. "Fatalist. Fatality if I'd aimed at him." And he was off again, for other men had joined the leaders, and the scent was hot. He carried them fast, up to the bald top of the mountain, where the going was faster, and down in the valley to the right. They had gained nothing on him, and Hammersley, with his second wind, was breathing more easily, but it was almost time to double. Here was as good a place as another for the pack of them to spend the afternoon, and he made up his mind to lose them without further ado. There was only one runner in the lot, and he was the fatalist, though how he had ever happened to learn to run in the Imperial Navy, Hammersley had not the time or inclination to decide. If his philosophy limped, his legs at least were strong, and he came on rapidly, leaping like a young buck toward the opening over the crest of the knob into which Hammersley had disappeared. A short way down was a spur of rock, the beginnings of a ridge which cut out into the hills, the watershed of 2 rills which leaped from rock to the valleys below. Hammersley chose the right-hand valley, for the going was better, and went down it at top speed for a quarter of a mile or more, pausing where the path led into the underbrush and pines until the fatalist should view him, when he disappeared, and then turning into the thicket, circled quickly to the left, and taking advantage of every cover, slowly and carefully climbed the ridge to a place of vantage, where he crouched and waited, to have the satisfaction a moment later of seeing his ex-jailer, weapon in hand, go plunging down the path past his place of concealment. Hammersley listened a moment to the sounds of crashing feet in front of him and behind, and then creeping slowly and making what speed he could, crossed the ridge and in a while was out of sight and hearing of them. He feared little in crossing the other valley, for his pursuers were strung out in a line, each in sight of the other, and would follow the leader like a flock of sheep. But there was little time to waste, and the greatest test of Hammersley's endurance and Doris's was to come. For 2, perhaps 3 hours, these men would search for him, and more would come. The fatalist would bear the brunt of their failure. But in the meanwhile, Hammersley must reach the cave in the Thorwald and take Doris to Blaufelden. The first part of the return run must be done at top speed to save time, which would be needed later. So when he crossed the second valley in safety and had reached the mountain top, Hammersley abandoned all caution, risking the chance of meeting Wentz and his men, and with a sharp look out ahead of him, went as fast as he could along the ridge, finding at last the trail by which he had come earlier in the day, down which he ran with a long stride which covered the 4 miles in less than half an hour. He reached the upper passage to the cave in safety, and in a moment was safe behind the projecting boulders of the amphitheater. He was breathing heavily, and the sweat was pouring from him. Doris was watching for him. "They're following you? They're coming?" she asked nervously. He quieted her and led her inside the cave, where he dropped for a moment of rest upon the stool. Doris watched him anxiously. In a moment he was laughing. "Oh, I let 'em a rippin' run straight for Schöndorf," he gasped. "They're patting me out 6 miles from here on the top of the Schmalzberg. Lord," he grinned, "but that was a breather." She brought him the pitcher of water, but he only rinsed his mouth. "How are you feeling? Fit?" She nodded. "Righto. Come along. We're off." He went over to the prisoner and examined his bonds carefully. "Poor old Udo," he muttered in German. "I've got to go. You might worry through those strings. It's the only way, because I'm not leaving any matches." He leaned over and patted his cousin on the shoulder. "Goodbye, Udo," he said. "We'll meet again some day. As friends, my cousin, as friends." Von Winden's eyes met Hammersley's, and then he lowered his head upon the balsam boughs. There was no time for amenities. Hammersley slipped on his leather jacket and cap, fastened his belt outside, reloaded his automatic, filled the pockets of Doris's coat with biscuit and chocolate, then made a bundle of the tools and spare parts, which he selected carefully, and in a moment he and Doris were outside on the ridge, peering over toward the road below. All was quiet, and they descended carefully to the projecting rock, pausing there to listen again. The machine of Wentz, which had been left near the crag, had gone on toward Mittelwald. Hammersley smiled. The plan had worked. It was working. They must succeed. Down in the bushes at the foot of the crag by the road, they paused again, listening, and then Hammersley went forward, peering out, up and down the road. Silence. Solitude. Leading the way, with the hand of the girl in his, he quickly crossed and plunged into the undergrowth, silently, until they had reached a distance which would defy detection from the road. Then Hammersley bore to the right and went on rapidly. Doris's heart was beating high with excitement and hope. The Yellow Dove. Could they reach the hangars safely? And when there, could they tune up undetected? The success of the venture seemed impossible, for there must still be men on guard at Blaufelden, someone. But as they went on through the wood, she found some of the contagion of Cyril's audacity. He seemed tireless. When they reached a trail which led in the desired direction, without speaking to her, he set forward into a steady jog trot, which put them well upon their way. He turned around from time to time and watched her, and when he saw that she was nearly blown, he slowed down to a walk and explained his plan. "Jolly flying weather this. Once we're in the air, they can't stop us, Doris. She's armored around the cockpit and engines, and they haven't anything heavier than a rifle at Blaufelden. We'll go up the Rhine to the sea, flying high, then cut to the left along the coast as far as the French line, and then go into Ypres, From there to General French's headquarters. You can easily tell by the lines of trenches. I want you to listen carefully. I've got 2 seats and double control. The arrangement is just the same as on your Newport, only she answers her control much more slowly. The wheel is on a universal joint, the gas on your wheel, the spark to your left, the magneto, a button in front of you. She starts by compressed air. But the exhaust, Cyril, she gasped. Before we go, it's only a few hundred yards from the shed to the house. We're going to risk that. With luck, we'll be moving in 3 minutes. And then, he paused grimly. And then, I'd like to see a dozen stop us. He had such perfect assurance that all doubt left her. Indeed, to Doris, he seemed endowed with some hidden fount of initiative and inspiration, and she was willing to believe anything he told her. They went on rapidly while he answered all her questions and gave her final instructions until at last they reached a path, the same, he told her, by which they had come from the farm last night. They started up a frightened deer which fled away from them, but they didn't pause until the path cut sharply to the right, and through the bushes they could see the buildings of Blaufelden. There they stopped and Hammersley went forward to investigate. In the direction of the farmhouse was no sign of animation except the thread of smoke that rose from the kitchen chimney. The back of the hangar was just in front of them, a bare wall of wood 150 feet long. The opening was upon the other side, to the west, a huge canvas flap toggled at the bottom to rings in the sill. Hammersley came back and whispered to Doris to follow him. Until the starting of the engine, this was the most hazardous part of the proceeding, for if they were seen from the house, there would be no time for Hammersley to put the engines in order. He led her south to a point in the woods where the storehouse hid them from the main buildings, when, crouching low to avoid possible detection from the LINDBERG road, they covered the 50 yards to the storehouse and waited again, completely hidden from all points except the forest behind them, while Cyril looked around the edge of the building and then beckoned her to follow. In a moment they had slipped between the end of the canvas flap and the door and were within the dusky interior of the shed. Before them stretched the wide expanse of the Yellow Dove, a huge biplane with a spread as nearly as Doris could figure it of 120 feet from tip to tip. She stood before it in wonder and awe, admiring its fine lines and sturdy appearance. A dragonfly her Newport was, beside this great eagle of the air. The other machine, an Ettrich monoplane, which was used by Udo von Winden, seemed lost in the shadows of the larger wings. Doris stood quite still, as Cyril had directed, while he moved off noiselessly in the dim light. She saw him slipping from one spot to another, quickly examining this and that, and at last saw him climb up into the machine with his kit of tools. She came nearer as he whispered down to her. "They've taken out some plugs. I'll have 'em in shortly. And then go around the lower plane and tell me if the guys are all taut." She did as he asked, while she heard him above working over the engines. "How long will it take?" she whispered. "I can't tell. 20 minutes, perhaps. The petrol tanks are empty too. I want to help. Are the wires all fast?" "Yes." "Good. Then bring me the hose from the petrol tank. It's there beside you in the corner. You can run it in while I'm working." She did as she was bid, climbing up with a feeling of exultation into the tall machine beside him. "The reserve tank first," he whispered. "Up here between the planes. Here's a wrench. The opening is on the top." They worked side by side noiselessly and efficiently, Hammersley fitting the missing spark plugs and connecting a new coil wire which had been removed. He looked over the machine carefully, but could find nothing else missing or even needing adjustment, for he had taken care yesterday morning, as was his custom, to go over the engine with his own hands. The impairment of the engine was of no serious consequence and intended only to delay. Von Strombeck had not counted on such a chance for readjustment as this, or upon Hammersley's reserve supply of necessary material. And unless they had done something else that he could not discover. But what? While he worked, Hammersley tried to think, casting between times anxious glances at the gears, the propellers, and the control wires. The reserve tank of petrol was filled, and the hose was steadily pouring the stuff into the one under the forward cockpit, which was full by the time the plugs and wires were all adjusted. "That will be enough, Doris," he whispered. "We only need to get to the English lines. There's no time for more." She saw him try the wheel, watching the connecting gear keenly, and when he ordered it, she climbed down into the rear seat. He gave her a leather coat, gloves, and helmet, and buckled her into her seat. Then, in a state of nervous tension, they waited. She saw Cyril climb down coolly, wiping his hands with a piece of waste, restore the hose to its place, and then peer out from a slit in the canvas door. Then he bent over and, running quickly along the flap from side to side, one after another, quickly unfastened the toggles which held it in place. "We've got to chance it now," he whispered up to her. "If she doesn't work, God help us." "But the canvas, the machine will." He stopped abruptly, for Doris's eyes were staring in panic at something behind him. Hammersley whirled quickly toward the slit in the canvas, his automatic in his hand. There, not 4 paces away, blinking into the dusk, stood the tall figure of His Excellency, General Graf von Stromberg. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, recording by Tony Oliva. From the heights. Hammersley had him covered, and the general made no move to defend himself. He bent his head and folded his arms, peering into Hammersley's eyes like a short-sighted man trying to adjust his vision to an unaccustomed task. But his frown relaxed almost immediately, and his lips separated, showing a gleam of teeth. "My compliments, Herr Hammersley," he said. "You have done well. It pleases me to meet at last." "Move your right hand again, the fraction of an inch, and I will shoot, Excellence," said Hammersley in the sharp, quick accents of a resolute man. Von Stromberg only smiled more broadly, but he did not move. He had seen enough of Herr Hammersley to respect his sincerity. "I have staked my professional reputation upon your presence elsewhere, Herr Hammersley. Instinct, perhaps, led me here. I do not know what else. But I came alone. I am not armed." Hammersley was in no mood for trifling, and time was flying. Better to shoot the man and be done with it. But he couldn't somehow. Instead, he searched him quickly for weapons. "You're too late, Excellence. I am sorry, but I have no time for conversation." "You will at least let me pay you the compliment of saying that the Prussian blood in you has made you the most brilliant Englishman I have ever met." "I have no time to match phrases with you." "Ah, but you match what is much more important, a genius for dissimulation. Yesterday you disappointed me, Herr Hammersley, with your talk of plans, of fortifications, of Strasbourg. I had been hoping that you were playing a deeper game, something that would relieve the flat monotony of my routine. You were to save me from utter boredom. It is true, I had hoped that. I was disappointed when I thought that you were like the others. Disappointed! I should have known." "And now that I have the papers, what are you going to do about it?" asked Hammersley with a touch of bravado. Von Stromberg shrugged. "I confess that I am so wrapped in admiration of your genius that I am at a loss. I must yield to the inevitable. But I am happy in the knowledge that only a person of the skill of Herr Hammersley could have succeeded in outwitting the head of the Secret Service Department of the Empire." "Enough of this," Hammersley broke in. "I should kill you, General von Stromberg, but I won't if you obey me promptly. Stand aside over there against the wall. If you move, I'll shoot. I'm going out of here." Von Stromberg did as he was bidden, and his long strides and erect carriage had lost none of their dignity. When he reached the wall, he turned with a smile. Then he said suavely, "I fear, Herr Hammersley, that you will not go forth as rapidly as you like." Hammersley only laughed at him. "We'll see about that." He took a stride to the canvas curtain and had a quick look outside, and then to the girl. "Cranker, Doris, the compressed air, the button to the left beside the wheel." There was a long pause when Doris reached forward in her seat, a pause filled with meanings for Hammersley, in which his fate and hers was hanging in the balance. Von Stromberg seemed to read his thoughts, and the wolfish smile spread again over his face. "It is just possible," he said blandly, "that someone may have been tinkering with the machinery." There was another long silence, a moment of agony for Hammersley. "Yes, I have," roared Hammersley exultantly. For just then there was a violent explosion, deafening in the enclosed space, like the roar of a giant cracker would have been. Another, and then more rapidly another, followed by a number of concussions, like a pack of giant crackers catching intermittently and then in quick succession. General von Stromberg's smile faded, then vanished in a look of inefficacy and dismay. He was senile. Hammersley's grin derided him. Speech was impossible, but the muzzle of the automatic was as eloquent as before. One more explosion, or 6 for that matter, would add little to the din. Von Stromberg's life hung by a hair at that moment, and he knew it. Still covering His Excellency, who was now glancing at the slit in the curtain beside him, Hammersley climbed up to the seat in front of Doris in the cockpit of the machine, and just as he was putting a leg over, His Excellency took a quick glance upward, which had in it a world of expression, and bolted. Hammersley's shot must have missed. He looked around at Doris and laughed, and she saw the light of triumph that rode in his eyes. The exhaust was roaring steadily now, but with one hand on the wheel and in the other his automatic, Hammersley sat motionless, watching the slits in the canvas for the men that he knew must come in a moment. At a gesture of his, Doris sank low in the cockpit, her hands on the wheel, watching too. and ready to do her share as Cyril had directed. 1, 2 minutes passed. She seemed to be counting the seconds. The body of the machine was trembling as though with the excitement of the moment, and the explosions had blended into one continuous roar. Cyril threw the clutch in, and the note lowered as the propellers began to whir. The huge fabric jumped forward, gathering momentum as it went, until by the time it reached the canvas curtain in front of it, it was going as fast as a man would run. The weight of the heavy flap retarded it for a moment, but it went steadily on, and the canvas was pushed outward, then rose. It seemed to Doris like the curtain on a melodrama. Men were running up, shooting as they ran. They clutched at the toggles and swung off their feet, falling in a heap upon the ground. She saw a man, the only one not in uniform, take hold of the lower plane and try to stop the momentum. It was John Rizzio. She saw his face for a second, dark, handsome, smiling. Cyril rose in his seat and their weapons streamed fire. Rizzio moved backward with the machine, still clinging to the lower plane, and then disappeared, passing under it just where the blades of the right-hand propeller were. A slight shock, and the shapeless mass went rolling over and over until it brought up motionless against the jamb of the door. 2 other men, foresters, warned by Rizzio's fate, sprang aside with horror in their eyes. Doris sank lower in her seat, her cheeks bloodless, grasping her wheel with icy hands, filled with horror. Cyril had sunk down in his seat, clutching at the side of the cockpit, his weapon falling from his fingers. With an effort, she steadied her hold on the wheel. The canvas curtain had passed over their heads. They were in the open. To the right, coming from the LINDBERG road, a machine filled with men was dashing across the field before them at a diagonal which would intercept them. She heard shots near at hand. Cyril did not move. She had a glimpse of General von Stromberg, who had snatched a pistol from the hand of the nearest soldier and fired. They were moving fast, but the automobile in the field before them seemed to be moving faster. Captain Wentz and 4 men. She saw Cyril's hand rise in front of her, pointing to the left to avoid them, but Wentz came on. The Yellow Dove was still running on its wheels. She saw the danger. Wentz was aiming at a collision. She pulled her wheel toward her instinctively, and the Yellow Dove rose, skimming the ground. She felt it lifting, slowly, now rapidly. The automobile seemed about to strike them. Another jerk on the wheel, and the skids of the Yellow Dove just grazed the windshield of the machine, and a soldier leaped into the air, trying to catch a hold, missed, and tumbled to the ground. In the car, men were shouting like demons, and a volley of pistol bullets pierced the planes. She felt them strike the armored body, but she sank lower, clutching her wheel. Clear? They must be. A second of agonized suspense, and she saw Cyril turn his head and look down behind them. His face was white, but his eye flashed triumph. His lips moved, but she heard nothing. Safe? They must be. The Yellow Dove, mounting easily, had cleared the trees at the border of the farm, and before the eyes of the girl stretched only undulating surfaces of gray and green. In front of her, Cyril lay back in his seat. His hands clutched the sides of the cockpit. Oh, God! She had not been sure before what his sudden lassitude had meant. He had been hit. John Rizzio. He turned around and smiled at her, and one hand, stretched before him, pointed up and to the right. Her throat closed, and her heart seemed to stop its beating, and the Dove for a moment swung and tossed like a drunken thing, but with an effort she inclined her wheel and met it. Cyril again raised his fingers and pointed upwards, higher. She tipped the wheel further toward her. His gesture was like an appeal to heaven, a symbol of his faith in her and in the God of both. She set her lips and obeyed. Broken and helpless, perhaps dying, he was putting his faith in her. She must not fail him now. She kept her gaze before her, over Cyril's head, trying to gain strength for what she had to do, thinking that she was in England at Ashwater Park, and that the wheel she held was that of her own little Newport. There seemed to be little difference between them, except that the Yellow Dove was easier to manage. It responded to the slightest touch and had a magnificent steadiness that reassured Doris as to her ability to do the thing that was required of her. The mountains had fallen below them, and the horizon had widened until it blurred into the haze of the distance. She looked down on what seemed to her a plain of purple velvet touched with lighter patches of orange and violet. Before her, the sun was setting blood red in a sea of amber. She mounted above it into the clear empyrean of azure. Higher, higher yet. She felt the exhilaration of large spaces, the joy of conquest over all material things. Death even did not dismay her. Cyril's, her own. She seemed to have crossed at a bound from the realm of substance into that of immateriality. Her soul already sang in accord with the angels. They were mated. She and Cyril mated, and even death should not separate them. Dusk fell slowly below them, like a black giant striding across the face of the earth. But all was still bright and clear about her. The red ball of the sun would not set. She was going upward, upward into the realm of continuous and perfect day. Below her, a thread of silk thrown carelessly upon a purple carpet. The Rhine. She saw Cyril's hand come up and move feebly to the right. She turned slowly and followed its direction. The Rhine. She remembered Cyril's words back there in the woods. She must follow the Rhine to the sea and then turn to the westward along the coast. She would do it. She must. Cyril was hurt, but perhaps not badly. His gestures reassured her. He moved his hand in a level line in front of him, and she understood. They had mounted high enough. The barograph showed 4,000 feet. She brought the wheel up to normal and held it there. The wind burned her cheeks, and she knew from the changes in the river below her that the speed of the Yellow Dove was terrific. 90 miles, 100, 120, an hour, perhaps much more. She did not know. The speed got into her blood. Faster and faster was the song her pulses sung. She was a part of the Yellow Dove now, and it was a part of herself. Its wings were her wings, and its instinct was in her own fingertips. Night fell slowly, a luminous night full of stars. She seemed to be hanging among them, to be one of them, watching the earth pass under her. 2 of them gleamed like St. Elmo's lights at the tips of the plains. The sky was clear and bright, of a deep bluish purple, like the sky she remembered high up on the plains of the Great West in her own country. The air was bitter cold upon her face, and she blessed Cyril's foresight of the helmet, gloves, and old leather jacket that he had put on her in the hangar. In front of her, Cyril leaned slightly to one side, and his right hand touched a button, throwing an electric light in a hood in front of the wheel upon the face of the compass and barograph. She glanced at them quickly. 4,000 feet. The direction north-northwest. She longed to speak to him and shouted his name, but in the roar of the engines she could not hear her own voice. He still sat up. The fingers of his right hand moving from time to time as he gave her the direction. She thanked God for that. He was alive. He would live until they reached Ypres. He must live. He must. She set her teeth upon the words and willed it, praying at last aloud with lips that screamed yet made no sound. Below her moved the lights of a city. She did not know what it was. Cologne, perhaps. She had passed it yesterday morning in the train with John Rizzio. Yesterday. It seemed a year ago. Cologne, then Düsseldorf. The river was not difficult to follow. She lost it once and then, moving at a lower altitude, she found it quickly. But the old terror was gripping her now. Cyril. His fingers no longer moved directing her. He had sunk lower in his seat and his head had fallen back upon one side, his face upturned to the stars. Was he? She put the thought from her. It was impossible. She had prayed. Not that. He had only fainted from pain, from sickness. Not dead. She would not, could not believe it. She longed to reach forward, to let him feel her hand upon his neck, that he might know her pity and her pain. It almost seemed better that death should come to them both now than that he should die and not know the comforting touch of her hand. She leaned forward and one hand left the wheel, but she lost her touch of the air and the planes tipped drunkenly, threatening the destruction she courted. The madness passed, and with its passing came a calm, ice cold. She was no longer a sentient being. She was merely an instinct with wings, flying as the eagle flies straight for its goal. She kept her glance upon the compass and followed the river, north, northwest. The silver thread had become a ribbon now, reflecting the starlight. She passed over other towns. She could see their lights, but her gaze was fixed most often on the distant horizon, where after a while she would find the sea. A yellowish light, painting the underside of the plane above her head, bewildered her. She could not understand. It was like a reflection of a candle inside a tent. Low as it was, it blinded her eyes, accustomed to the soft light of the stars. There was a crash nearby. In the very air beside her, it seemed, a blinding flash of light, and the yellow dove toppled sideways. Instinctively she caught it, turning as she went and rose higher, higher, as a bird flies at the sound of a shot below. She knew now what it meant. A searchlight. They were firing at her with the high-angle guns. She had come fast, but the wire from LINDBERG had been faster. She put the light behind her, and long arms of light still groped for her, but she rose still higher, 5,000-6,000 feet, her barograph told her. Below, to her right, a small thing, shaped like a dragonfly, was spitting fire. To her left another, but she sank lower in her seat, laughing at them. Something of Cyril's joyous bravado possessed her. She defied them, rising far above them, higher, 7,000 feet, 8, until she could see them no more. North, northwest. She found her course again and flew on into the night. She had lost the river, but that did not matter now. She knew that after a time, an hour or more, she must come to the sea. And when all signs of danger were gone, she went down again where she could more plainly see the earth. The moon had come up and bathed the scene below with its soft light, and far ahead of her she saw irregular streaks of pale gray against long lines of purplish black. The sea? She had lost all idea of time and distance. How far the sea was from LINDBERG she did not know, and if she had known it, the passage of time was a blank to her. A continuous roar, the music of the spheres, which took no thought of time or space. The flight had lasted but a minute and an eternity. To her left, the gray streaks were nearer, west by north, her compass said, and she steered for them. Soon she made out distinctly contours of large masses of gray against the black, water and land. The air was milder and she sniffed the salt. She went down to 3,000 feet to get her bearings, ever watchful for the dragonflies and ready to soar again at the first flash of a searchlight. She had already learned to avoid the plains where the lights were grouped, the colonies of glowworms that here meant danger. Had she crossed the Belgian line? She had been to Antwerp, to Brussels, and tried to remember what they had looked like on the map. There was water near Antwerp, she remembered that, inland bodies of water which led to the sea. Now she could see beyond the bodies of inland water to a wide expanse of gray beyond the dark, uninterrupted gray, the ocean. She bore to her left until her course was due west. A searchlight flashed upon her for a second and was gone. By the way the contours were changing, she knew that her speed was terrific, and slowly, but more and more certainly, as she neared the sea, a problem presented itself. Her goal. Where was it? And how to find it in the dark? Cyril had said that they must land back of Ypres. But where was Ypres? Beyond Ostend and inland 30-40 miles. She knew that much from the war maps that she had pored over with her father. But how to find it? She was over the sea now. The Yellow Dove felt a new breeze and the wheel tugged under her hand, but the machine lifted at the touch and wheeled like a gull to speed down the coast. Ostend! The Kursaal! If she could get a sight of it! It was dangerous, but she must go lower, 200 feet from the sea, where she might make out familiar profiles against the sky. The waves rose to meet her, reflecting the starlight, and just below her, to the left, the surf rolled in lines of white upon the beach. Dunes, dunes interminably, with here and there a collection of huts. A dark shape moved in the water ahead of her. Another. Warships. Destroyers. She wheeled out to sea and flew above them. But before they had time even to get their searchlights ranged upon her, the danger was past. She would win now. The Yellow Dove was invincible. A dark, irregular mass ahead of her rose above the monotony of dunes, buildings, and a bulk she seemed to recognize. A round dome, iridescent like a soap bubble in the moonlight. The Kursaal! Ostend! She was nearing her destination, the end of the German lines. Friends were near, Belgians, French, and English. 20-30 miles beyond Ostend, and then inland, somewhere back of Ypres, she would find the English. The English lines were 30 or 40 miles long. She remembered. It should not be difficult to find them. She must be sure to go far enough, but not too far. Not to where the French army joined the British forces. Cyril's papers must go to the English, to General French himself. He had said so. She had no way of judging distance except by the passage of the minutes. At the speed she was flying, she must turn inland in 15 minutes. She had no watch, and she tried counting the seconds. She had counted 60 4 times when a battery hidden among the dunes along the shore opened fire on her. She was half a mile from shore, flying low, but the flash of light startled her and the shell burst beyond. She rose quickly, moving further out to sea, frightened but still self-possessed. It would not do to fail now, with the goal in sight. The compass gave her course southwest by west. She counted again, guessing at the time she had lost, and then, making a wide spiral out to sea and rising to 3,000 feet, she drove the Yellow Dove inland. Searchlights were turned on her and shots fired, but she went higher, trying to make out, if she could, the lines of the opposing armies. Red and yellow lights were displayed below to her left, and far to her right were tiny clusters of lights. But there seemed to be no order in their arrangement, no lines that she could distinguish even at this height. Her keen eyes, now inured to the darkness, made out a monoplane against the starlight ahead of her. But she swerved to the right, the greater power of the Yellow Dove enabling her to rise and elude it. She flew for what seemed 10 or 15 minutes, going steadily to the south and west, when she drove for a spot where there were no lights and then shut off the throttle and dove. She knew that this was perhaps her greatest moment of her great adventure, a landing place in the dark in a country she did not know, where a church steeple, a telegraph wire, the limb of a tree would bring her and her precious freight to disaster. With a sudden shutting off of the power, a silence that bewildered her, a silence broken only by the whir of the wind against the plains. Her ears ached from the change of pressure in her swift descent. She eased her wheel back gently, trying to make out objects below. Dark patches, woods to be avoided. The roof of a house, another. Lights here and there, small, obscure, which she had not seen. She avoided them all, planing down in a spiral toward what seemed to be unobstructed space. She breathed a prayer as the earth came up to meet her. Death, whatever came, Cyril too. She stared straight before her, feeling out the wind pressure on the plains, gliding as near the horizontal as she dared. An open field. Thank God. A gentle shock and the springs responded. The Yellow Dove rebounded slightly and ran along the ground smoothly upon its wheels, then stopped. She tried to get up, but could not. Her hands seemed fastened to the wheel. She heard the sound of men's voices shouting and saw lights, but she could not seem to make a sound. She was shivering violently, also laughing a little. She had no sense of being cold. She seemed very weak somehow and very helpless. And then, just as the lights grew brighter, they went out. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tony Oliva. Headquarters. A woman, she heard a man's voice say at her ear. She was lying upon the ground, and strange faces were bending over her. Well, I'm damned. English. And the other, she heard again. Dead as a herring. Doris sat up, staring at them wildly. Wait, there's a flutter here yet, she heard the other man say. Come, Bill, let's have him over to the house. Doris managed to find a whisper. A surgeon for him, she said to the man supporting her. He will not die. He is only wounded. It was her obsession. It would not leave her. She saw them carrying Cyril toward the house, and when they wanted to take her too, she said that she would walk. Though deathly weak, she managed to reach the house where they had carried Cyril. They gave her a drink of something, and she revived. It was a Red Cross station, they told her, and the doctor would be here in a moment. But in the meanwhile, first aid was administered, and at her place at his bedside, she saw Cyril struggling faintly back to life. He will not die, she repeated quietly, when the surgeon had examined him gravely. I hope not. But he's bled a good deal. We'll see." They cut away his coat and wanted to send her away, but she pleaded to remain, and in a moment she heard Cyril's voice whispering hoarsely, "Papers? Coat pocket. Sir John, French." "All right," said the surgeon cheerfully. "We'll see to that. Doris." "Here, Cyril." "Rippin' fine of you. No mistake. Old girl." His whisper trailed off into silence, and at the surgeon's orders they led her away from his cot. But she would not leave the room until she got the papers out of the pocket of his jacket. An orderly led her to a young officer with his arm in a sling, who sat at a table in another part of the building. He listened to her story attentively and read the documents carefully, his lips as he read emitting a thin whistle. He glanced at his watch and for a moment left the room. "It is arranged. You shall go," he said when he came back. "A machine will be here in a moment." He paused, examining her doubtfully. She was spattered with grease and oil, but the pallor of her face beneath its grime showed that her strength was near its end. "Wouldn't you trust those dispatches to me? It's 10 miles to the headquarters in Rough." "No, no. I will go. I promised." But he ordered some hot coffee and bread, and thus fortified, when the motor came around she was driven upon her way. The young officer sat beside her, eagerly listening, while she gave him a brief outline of their adventures. "Amazin'," he said from time to time. "Most amazin'." And then as she went on, he said quietly, "You're going on your nerve, I think. Better save your strength until we get to headquarters. It isn't far now." She tried to keep silent, but it seemed as though she must go on talking. That seemed to give her strength to complete her task, for when she sank back in her seat and tried to relax, she only grew weak thinking of Cyril lying back there, hovering between life and death. And then she heard herself saying aloud, "He will not die. He has gone through too much to die now." The man beside her glanced down at her and smiled gently. "No, he isn't going to die. Bullets don't kill nowadays unless they kill at once." "Yes, yes," she assented. "That's it. If he had been going to die, he would have been dead now, wouldn't he?" She laid her hand eagerly on the young officer's arm, and he put his hand over hers. "Palmerston is the best surgeon along this part of the line. He'll pull him through. Don't you worry." "I won't. I'll try not to." "You're awfully kind. Would you mind telling me your name?" "Jackson, 2nd Leinster Dragoons. And yours?" "Mather. Doris Mather. I don't want to forget your name. You've been very good to understand everything so perfectly." "Oh, it's nothing. There are reasons I'm on headquarters staff, you know." That was one reason. But another one was that there was a girl at home just as much worried over his wound as Miss Mather was over Hammersley's. They passed from the rough roads between gates into a smoother one which was bordered with poplars. At the end, in front of her, she saw lights and reached a doorway where an orderly opened the door of the machine and saluted her companion. Their arrival, it seemed, was expected. Captain Jackson took her by the arm and led her indoors, for her courage or her nerves seemed to be failing her again, down a quiet hall into a room where an officer with a gray mustache sat before a lighted lamp at a table covered with papers. She recognized him at once from the many portraits that had appeared in the weekly papers. He spoke to her and she tried to reply, but she could not. She seemed only to have strength enough to thrust the papers forward into his hand when her knees gave way under her and she sank in a heap upon the floor. Gentle hands lifted her and laid her upon a couch in the corner of the room. She tried to get up but could not. She heard the voices of the officers in the room as from a great distance, and then a woman came and two men carried her upstairs and put her to bed. She realized that she was talking incoherently of Cyril, of the Yellow Dove. They gave her something to drink, and her nerves grew mysteriously quiet. She seemed to be sailing smoothly through the air, higher, higher. Cyril's fingers were pointing upward. She was tipping the wheel toward her, ever toward her, and they rose higher. They had reached the region of continuous and perfect day. Cyril turned his head and looked at her, and then he smiled. It was broad daylight when she awoke, for the sunshine was streaming in at the window. A woman sat near her, knitting. She was an old woman of many wrinkles, kindly wrinkles which seemed to vie with one another to express placidity. As Doris rose in her bed, the old woman rose too and came forward, briskly speaking in French. "Ah, mademoiselle is awake. Bon. She is feeling better?" "Yes, better, but a little tired." And then as she realized where she was, "Could you tell me General French? Could I see him?" "All is well, mademoiselle. Monsieur le Général, he is not here now, but he will be back after a while. He will see you then. But first it is proper that you have breakfast and a bath. Mademoiselle needs a bath, I think." Doris glanced at her hand, which lay upon the white coverlet. It was black. "Yes, I will bathe. But first, will you tell me?" The old woman smiled as she interrupted. "I was to tell you that Monsieur yonder is better. That is what mademoiselle wished to know, is it not?" Doris sank back upon her pillow in a silence which gave the full measure of her joy. Cyril would recover. She had been sure of it. She had told them last night. God was good. The news gave her strength, and the coffee and eggs which were brought revived her rapidly. Her nerves still trembled in memory of what they had passed through, but when she was bathed and dressed in clean linen garments, much too large for her, a surgeon brought her medicine, and what was better than medicine, news that Cyril was conscious and was asking for her. But they would not let her go to him. Tomorrow, perhaps. Meanwhile, the doctor would be glad to take a message. Doris colored gently. The message that she would have liked to send was not to be transmitted by this means. "Tell him," she said at last quietly, "that I am well and that I will see him when I have permission to do so." The officer smiled, gave some directions to the old woman, and went out. It was not until late in the afternoon, when dressed in her own garments, which had been carefully cleansed and brushed by her nurse, that she was admitted to the office of the field marshal. She was shown into his room, and he greeted her with unmistakable cordiality, offering her the chair next to his own and congratulating her warmly upon the success of her achievement and Cyril's. "You know," he asked quietly, "the contents of these documents?" "Yes, their importance made it necessary that I should." "Then, of course, you realize the necessity for the utmost secrecy?" "I do." The general smiled at her and brought forward a copy of a recent issue of the London Times. "Did you know that for the last 3 days England has actually stopped criticizing me to talk about you?" "About me?" she asked. "Yes. Read," he said, smiling. And she took the paper from him, skimming the headings of a news item he pointed out to her. Miss Mathers still missing. Mysterious disappearance still unaccounted for. Lady Heathcote tells strange story. John Rizzio, the famous collector, a German spy. And then in the news item below, Alison Mather of Ashwater Park, believing that his daughter is still alive, today offered a reward of £5,000 to anyone. She stopped reading and put the paper down. Poor Daddy, she whispered. Oh, Sir John, will you let him know? I have already done so, child. He knows that you are safe. And then with a laugh, the £5,000, I think, are mine. I need a new hospital core. Oh, he'll give it, I'm sure. You promise? Yes. He took her hand and rose in the act of dismissal. We have supper at 6. I hope you will be able to join us. But General? She paused at the door. He smiled at her softly. If it all goes well, you shall see him tomorrow. She colored prettily. Everyone seemed to know, but she didn't care. The world, in spite of its terrors, was a garden of roses to Doris. She did not see Cyril the next day or the one following. His temperature had risen, and while the danger of a relapse was not acute, they thought it safer that she should be kept away. She had worried, fearing the worst, but the frankness of the head surgeon reassured her. The bullet had drilled through him, just scraping the lung. He would recover. But why take a chance of complication when all was going well? There was no reply to that, so Doris waited at headquarters, thankful and trying to be patient, sending 2 penciled scrawls which were delivered to the wounded man. It was not until 3 days later that she received word that she would be permitted to see him. His cot had been carried into a small room at the front of the building, and she entered it timidly, the nurse, with a smile and a glance at her watch, both of which were eloquent, withdrawing. He was propped up on pillows, and though pale from the loss of blood, greeted her with his old careless smile. She sank into the chair by the side of the bed and caught his hand to her lips. "Oh, Cyril," she murmured. "Cyril, I'm so glad. But I knew you wouldn't die. You couldn't, after getting safely through everything else." "Die? Well, hardly. I'm right as rain. Jolly close shooting that of Rizzio's though. Pity he had to go that way." She hid her face in her hands. "Don't. Let's forget him." And then, "Have you suffered much?" "No. The bally thing burns a bit now and then. But the worst of it is they won't let a chap smoke." She laughed and he caught her hand closer. "How did you do it, Doris? How did you?" he questioned. "I had to, Cyril," she said. "It wasn't anything except knowing where to come down. That bothered me. I guessed at Ypres. The rest was luck." "More than luck, old girl. Just courage and intelligence. I felt myself failing up there, but I saw you knew your way about, and then I seemed to go to sleep. Silly of me, wasn't it?" "Silly? You fainted, Cyril." "Rotten time to faint." "You might have died up there. Once I thought you had died. Oh, that dreadful moment. I wanted to go too, with you. I was a little mad, I think. I wanted to take you in my arms and go with you. Down, down. My hands even left the wheel. The Yellow Dove toppled, but I caught her. Poor child. After that, I seemed to grow all cold with reason and skill. I forgot you. I looked beyond, over your poor head. I had to succeed, Cyril. That was all." His hand pressed hers tenderly. "You're the only girl in the world who could do it. I'm glad, proud." He broke off. "My word, Doris, there's no use trying to tell you what I think of you. I'm no good at that sort of thing. I understand. You're just yourself. That's enough for me. You're a trump up there in the THORWALD to stay with poor old Udo, but I had to go. It was the only way. I never thought we'd make it." "But we did." "You did. It was the Dove, Doris. The good old Dove. Isn't she a ripper?" "I never had a fear." once she rose. How did you happen? He laughed. It was to be a surprise. I'd been working on her for a year, trying her out on the moors. Nobody knew until the war came, and then I told Udo, who told von Stromberg. I tried a flight to Windenberg and made it comfortably. Awfully easy thing. I stayed at Windenberg in October, flying over the English lines and dropping bombs. That was where you were. But I never hit anything. Wouldn't do, you know. Then, when I came back, I told the War Office. They sent me for the papers. You know the rest. Oh, Cyril, I'm so glad it's over. You'll go to England now and rest. For a while. And then, will you marry me, Doris, soon? Yes, she said softly. Whenever you want me. Here? Now? But Cyril, there's a parson chap about here somewhere. I saw him browsing in here the other day. Isn't it a little? Say you will. There's a dear. Yes, if you wish it. But what? Clothes? Nonsense. You're jolly handsome in those togs. Handsome no end, he repeated. Marry me tomorrow, Doris. There's a dear. She leaned her face down upon his hand. We're already married, Cyril. Up there, I felt it. Even death couldn't have separated us. Thank God. Kiss me, Doris. She obeyed. I'll see Jackson, he whispered. He'll manage it. Resourceful chap, Jackson. He'll get us a chaplain like pulling a rabbit out of a hat. She laughed. I don't suppose I'd ever have known you, Cyril, over there in England. You always did wonderful things carelessly, Cyril, but not this wonderful thing. And he kissed her. It is a wonderful thing, she whispered. So wonderful that I wonder if it can be true. I'll prove it to you. But she had straightened and kissed his hand. No more now. I mustn't stay. I hear them in the hall. Tomorrow? He asked. Yes. Jackson? Yes. The nurse knocked discreetly and entered. 5 minutes. I'm sorry. So am I, said Hammersley with a sigh. 3 weeks later, they stood side by side at the rail of the Channel boat on the way to Ashwater Park for the parental blessing. The shores of France were already purple in the distance. They had looked upon death with eyes that did not fear, but the sight of it together had made the bond of their fealty and tenderness the stronger. There was a sadness in his look, and she knew instinctively of what he was thinking. Germany, Cyril, she said aloud. I love it because a part of it is you, but I love England more because it is you. Hammersley watched the receding shores beyond the vessel's wake, her hand in his. They're following false gods, Doris, gods of steel and brass. They must fall, Cyril. They will. And then, but you can't help admiring the beggars. Poor old Udo. I think about him, Cyril. Do you think he got away? Well, rather. I cut his bonds with a hunting knife before we went down. She looked up into his face in amazement. You dared do that? He laughed. You wouldn't have let him be more generous than me. And he let us go. He didn't think we could go. He left things to destiny. Good old Udo, she repeated, and then dreamily, destiny. You were not meant to die, Cyril. Not yet, he said slowly, but I must go back over there, Doris. She shivered a little and drew closer to him. Yes, I know, she said, but you've earned. I couldn't ever earn what I've got, he broke in quickly. Nor I. I'm not much of a chap at pretty speeches and all that sort of thing, but you're a rare one, you know, the rummiest sort of a rare one. The kind a chap dreams about but never gets. And yet I've got you. Oh, hang it all, Doris, he broke off helplessly. You know. She smiled at him and slipped her arm through his. Yes, I know, she said. Good old Doris, he muttered. Silly ass, aren't I? But she wouldn't admit that. End of chapter 23. End of The Yellow Dove by George Gibbs.